Viserys Targaryen remembered the sound of bells tolling through King's Landing on the final day of his father's reign, a distant echo that resounded still in the hollow places of his mind. The shrieking of ravens had mingled with the clang of steel, and the stench of fire replaced the fragrance of roses in the Red Keep's gardens. Even as a boy, he had understood that day would shape his destiny, brand him in ways he would never fully comprehend. His father was the Mad King, they all said, the tyrant who burned men alive and cackled at their screams. But to Viserys, it was simply father, silver-haired, regal in his youth, fervent in his beliefs of Targaryen majesty. He had grown to despise the memory of that madness, even as it was all that remained of his heritage. He was barely old enough to hold a sword the day the gates of the city fell. Yet he had clutched one anyway. A short blade meant more for ceremony than for war, a trembling metal comfort in small hands. He was forced away before the final tragedy, whisked by loyal retainers who had saved his life. That blade had not saved him, but it had saved the notion that he could be something more than a beggar king wandering foreign lands. Years later, in the swirl of Essosi markets and desert roads, he would sometimes close his eyes and recall how the steel rang in the corridor as he was pulled away. It was in Braavos he learned the first lessons of caution. Cloaked in borrowed clothes, passing through narrow streets that smelled of salt and brine, he was told to keep his head down, to say nothing of dragons or the Iron Throne. He was forced to pretend to be a merchant's son, or a lost aristocrat from Lys, or an orphan from Tyrosh, depending on whom they were fooling that day. Daenerys was only a baby in those days, wailing for milk, wide purple eyes taking in the world without fear. Viserys was the one who stared bitterly at the children of Braavos playing in the squares. Sometimes he saw scabby youths swinging wooden swords, reenacting heroic tales they had heard in taverns. He longed to tell them the truth, that he was the son of the last true king, that one day they would bow before him, or else face the wrath of dragons. But he was taught, time and again, that words could condemn him to the same fate as his father. He remembered nights spent in damp attics, or cramped rooms above unremarkable taverns, the little patch of the starry sky that flickered through the battered shutters. He remembered the times he whispered a lullaby to Daenerys, when no one else would, even as resentment coiled in his heart. Resentment that he, a rightful Targaryen, the heir to Aegon the Conqueror's line, was forced to scrounge for bread. He never ceased to love his sister. Though in him brewed a complicated swirl of dominion and duty, he clung to her as the only piece of home he had left. They drifted across Essos, from Braavos to Pentos, from Lys to Myr, illusions of grandeur swelling in Viserys' chest as he played the part of exiled royalty. Each time a merchant or a magister offered a coin or a bed for the night, he told himself it was because they recognized his station. He repeated the vow that he would have his crown and his throne. He believed that destiny curled like a dragon's tail around him. He had always heard Targaryens were made for greatness, that their bond with dragons was unlike any other. Still, he had seen no dragons beyond ancient skulls in the Red Keep, and the old stories seemed to fade from the world. He began to suspect he might be the last ember of a dying house. On stormy nights, he cursed the fates that robbed him of the birthright he felt so acutely in his blood. The Targaryen name was supposed to mean power, fire, and flight. But where was it now, as he huddled in the corner of a borrowed mansion or groveled for coin to pay for Daenerys' next meal? The flame that once scorched the Seven Kingdoms had been reduced to a smoldering spark. Then came the 3 petrified dragon eggs. They were gifted during an obscure ceremony in Pentos, where Illyrio Mopatis held a lavish feast to honor the Targaryen siblings, or so the Magister claimed. Illyrio was a man of remarkable girth and cunning, with a sheen of wealth that never ceased to dazzle Viserys' hungry eyes. Little Daenerys, meek and radiant, was but a means to an end, or so Viserys thought at first. She could be wed to a Dothraki Khal, or to some powerful Essosi prince, all for the sake of Targaryen restoration. Viserys had heard the rumors about how Illyrio came to possess these fabled eggs. Some said they were discovered in a stone vault beneath the ruins of Valyria. Others claimed they were found in the Shadowlands. Regardless, they were a marvel, smooth and cool to the touch, with shimmering scales of black, green, and cream. Viserys remembered the moment he first laid eyes on them. The chamber was lit by tall candles, the wax dripping like pale tears. The eggs sat in a velvet-lined chest, each exuding a strange, silent promise. Their surfaces glimmered as if longing to awaken from centuries of slumber. Viserys could not tear his gaze away. A shiver, both fearful and excited, passed through him. He felt an inexplicable draw, as though the eggs recognized him, a sensation deeper than mere curiosity. It felt like the brush of destiny's fingertips along his skin. In those days, everyone assumed Daenerys was the one fated for something extraordinary. She was the younger sibling, unburdened by the same bitterness that weighed on Viserys, and the men around them whispered that Targaryen magic often emerged unexpectedly in the pure of heart. But Viserys saw differently. He saw how Daenerys gently touched the shells and offered a faint smile. Yet she never truly seemed to believe they would hatch. She admired their beauty and clung to the old tales, but there was no desperation in her to see them awaken. Viserys, on the other hand, felt that desperate longing every moment he breathed. A Targaryen without a dragon was incomplete, he believed, adrift in a world that refused to revere him. If only one of these eggs would hatch, if only the old magic would stir again, then the world would see who he truly was. So Viserys began spending hours with the eggs, running his palms across their ridges, watching how torchlight played across their surfaces. He whispered ancient Valyrian incantations that he had gleaned from fragments of lore. He heated them over braziers, read them passages from musty tomes of dragon lore. At first, these acts were done in secret, for he worried Illyrio might think him mad, or that Daenerys might laugh at him. But every time he pressed a hand to the shells, he felt a faint pulse, so faint it might have been imagination, and yet it fueled the spark of conviction that burned inside him. He was haunted by a dream that returned many times over the span of months. In it, he saw a roiling storm of fire overhead, swirling embers dancing like frantic moths. He stood amidst black stone spires that crumbled under the weight of centuries. From the shadows, a great beast emerged, scaled like twilight, its eyes gleaming with molten gold. As it roared, Viserys felt both terror and exultation. Flames licked at his skin, but they did not burn him. Instead, they filled him, surging through his veins as if he were becoming flame itself. He always woke in a cold sweat, chest heaving, gasping for the last vestiges of that power. In those moments, even as reality reasserted itself, he thought he glimpsed the flicker of the dragon's eye in the darkness of his small chamber. One sweltering night, he found himself alone, crouched by a low fire in one of Illyria's antechambers. The stars glittered outside, and the city of Pentos was hushed. The rest of the household slept. Viserys had stolen away 2 of the eggs from the chest, a swirl of mania in his veins that he could no longer contain. Carefully, he placed them near the flames, letting the heat wash over them. For a long time, nothing happened. The eggs lay inert, lifeless lumps of petrified shell. Viserys' frustration mounted. He was about to curse them, to fling them aside and brood in the corners of his mind, when suddenly a faint crackling sound reached his ears. He froze. The fire sputtered. He stared, scarcely breathing. The black egg shifted, just a fraction of movement along its curved surface, as though something within had stirred in response to the heat. His heart thundered. He reached out, caressing the shell with trembling fingers. The scales were hot, almost too hot to touch, yet he pressed his palm to it in silent entreaty. His mind, near delirious with excitement, recited those old Valyrian words again, summoning echoes of the illusions he had built around himself. There was a moment, fleeting but profound, in which the crackling intensified. Hairline fissures formed along the shell, pale lines in the darkness of its texture. For a heartbeat, Viserys was certain the egg would hatch on the spot. But then, the fire guttered low, and the lines vanished, the egg still once more. He did not sleep the rest of the night. He paced, raked his fingers through his silver blonde hair, and tried again, and again, and again. No matter how he tended the fire, no matter how he whispered his pleas, the egg showed no further sign of stirring. By morning, he felt as if he were teetering on the brink of madness. But that faint movement, that small sign, could not be forgotten. He carried that secret with him for weeks, uncertain what it meant. Could an egg that moved and cracked ever be restored to dormancy so easily? Perhaps he had imagined it. Perhaps the old magic was taunting him. Yet his conviction would not waver. Something had shifted, and it would not be undone. When Illyrio proposed the idea of Daenerys marrying Khal Drogo, Viserys seized upon it. He did not share the same gentle warmth toward his sister that Daenerys might have hoped for. For Viserys, it was a calculated move, forging an alliance that would grant him the power of the Dothraki hordes. He still pretended Daenerys was the key to his ascension, though in the quiet corners of his mind, a new notion had emerged. He imagined leading armies astride a living, breathing dragon. He imagined forging a new era, carving out a path of fire and blood across Westeros. He told himself that if the eggs were to hatch, it would be by his will, and thus he alone would be the rightful dragon rider. The wedding was an extravagant affair on the outskirts of Pentos, stretching for days with feasts, horse races, and savage displays of Dothraki culture. Drums beat like thunder, and the crackle of bonfires lit the sky. Daenerys, still hardly more than a child, seemed both entranced and petrified by Khal Drogo's presence, a warlord with a mane of braided hair and eyes like molten bronze. Viserys feigned a brother's pride, but inside he was twisting with impatience. The gifts bestowed upon Daenerys ranged from fine silks and spiced wines to a magnificent white filly. But none fascinated Viserys as much as the 3 dragon eggs that Illyrio set before her. A swirl of gasps fluttered through the gathered onlookers. To most, they were petrified ornaments, relics of a lost age. Viserys pretended to watch Dothraki dancers performing acrobatic feats under the flickering torches, but in truth, his gaze was glued to those eggs. The memory of that single crack haunted him. He wondered if, in the swirl of celebration, he might slip away with them, vanish into the night. But he knew better. So he held his tongue, smiled his serpent smile, and congratulated his sister through clenched teeth. In the following weeks, the Khalasar prepared to depart for the vast Dothraki sea. Daenerys would ride with Khal Drogo. Viserys loathed the idea of traveling with savage horse lords, but necessity demanded it. He pretended subservience when speaking to the Khal, all the while counting the days until he could claim the power he believed was meant for him. Yet an unsettling detail emerged. Daenerys seemed to be warming to the eggs in her own way, carrying them close even in the scorching heat. Viserys watched her in silent jealousy. He was the older brother, the rightful king, the last dragon. If any miracle were to occur with those eggs, it should happen for him. He who carried the memory of their father and the ancient prophecy that Targaryens were destined to rule the sky. There came a night when a great feast was held beneath the open sky as the Khalasar made camp. Viserys lingered on the outskirts, sipping sour wine from a wooden cup, half wishing the Dothraki would show him more of the respect he felt he deserved. Torches staked around the massive gathering glowed like a ring of captured stars, and the laughter of warriors rumbled through the air. In the distance, Daenerys sat, her eyes distant and sad as she stroked one of the eggs. Viserys tightened his grip on the cup, feeling a pang of rage. A small voice inside told him to keep his composure, to remember that the true path to greatness might take longer than he had hoped. But the wine, strong and unrefined, clouded his better judgment. He stalked toward her, intending to snatch the egg from her lap, to remind her that she held something far beyond her station, that it belonged to him, and always had. Before he could reach her, one of Drogo's bloodriders stepped in his way, glaring with dark, unblinking eyes. Viserys recognized the unspoken challenge, a silent warning that no harm would come to the Khal's bride. He retreated, heart pounding with fury. That night, he tossed and turned in his tent. Dreams plagued him again. Visions of wings unfolding against a crimson sky, a roar that shook the earth. He saw a silver-haired figure walking through flames and emerging unscathed. But in the kaleidoscope of half-formed images, Sometimes the face was his, and sometimes it was Daenerys. When he woke at dawn, drenched in sweat, he could not shake the dread that threatened to hollow him out. The journey across the Dothraki Sea was merciless. Endless plains of tall grass undulated like waves across the horizon, and the heat pressed down like a heavy hand. The Dothraki rode tirelessly, singing and bellowing war cries. Viserys lagged behind, unused to the constant sun and the hard saddle. He seethed, feeling humiliated at how he was treated, like some unwanted ornament that Daenerys dragged along. He tried to console himself by recalling the stories of conquest, how Aegon and his sisters had used dragons to unite the Seven Kingdoms. It was that kind of power the world would fear again, once the eggs awakened. But the eggs showed no signs of hatching. Days and nights blurred together. Each time Viserys glimpsed Daenerys, she held them with an almost reverent gentleness. The knowledge that those eggs lay in her possession, responding to her warmth, fueled his anger. Why did she get to hold them so tenderly? He told himself she only carried them for him, that once the dragon stirred, it would be he who commanded them. Still, doubt crawled through his mind. He remembered the faint fissure he had seen weeks ago, the fleeting sign of life within the black egg. For him, that moment was a beacon of hope. But it had never repeated. As the Khalasar continued onward, Viserys' bitterness and impatience became a poison that seeped through his every thought. It tainted his relationship with Daenerys. He snapped at her whenever she tried to speak to him, calling her a silly child who could never fathom the weight of the dragon legacy. Daenerys, once timid, began to raise her eyes with a new steel in them, a faint hint that she was finding her own footing among the horse lords. That only served to stoke Viserys' fury more. His days were consumed by fantasies of vengeance. He relished imagining the day he would lead the Dothraki across the narrow sea. Sacks of gold and steel behind him, and dragons overhead. He saw kings landing trembling at his approach, the bells ringing in fear this time, not celebration. He heard the cheers of common folk finally recognizing him as King Viserys, third of his name. It was an illusion he nurtured with feverish zeal. The only detail missing was the final key to everything. The dragons. One twilight, as the sky bled into shades of orange and violet, the Khalasar made camp near a sluggish river. Large tents rose, and the sound of horses whickering drifted across the grasslands. Viserys, discontent as ever, wandered away from the main camp to brood. The tall grasses whispered around him in the breeze, and the coppery smell of impending rain hung in the air. He yearned for something, anything, to break the cycle of waiting. He found Daenerys alone, kneeling at the riverbank. She had her sleeves rolled, bathing her hands. The setting sun gilded her hair, and one of the eggs, glossy green and flecked with gold, rested nearby. She seemed lost in thought, and for a moment, Viserys saw a fragility in her that reminded him of the frightened girl she had been, the sister who had clung to him in their wanderings. But that memory warred with his resentment. He approached, stepping loudly enough to signal his presence. She turned, eyes catching the last rays of daylight. "Brother," she said quietly. There was something cautious in her tone. His gaze flicked to the egg lying on a folded cloth by her side. "You guard them jealously," he noted, biting back the venom in his voice. "Ace, if you have some claim to them." She lowered her eyes. "They were a gift to me." He let out a humorless laugh. "A gift to you from Illyrio, perhaps. But we both know they represent our heritage. Mine, especially. The throne is mine by rights. If there is any chance these eggs carry life, then it is I who should be nurturing them." "Denise." She hesitated. "I never said I would deny you. They are Targaryen eggs for a Targaryen future." For a moment, he heard honesty in her words, but he couldn't bear the quiet confidence that she had begun to emanate. He knelt beside her, ignoring the damp earth seeping through his breeches. Gently, he picked up the egg, turning it in his hands. Its scales caught the dying light and seemed to shimmer. Holding it like that, so close, a trembling overcame him. He thought he felt a stir beneath the shell, as if a faint heartbeat thrummed against his palms. "Do you feel it?" he asked, voice suddenly hushed. "It's alive, I can sense it. I was meant for this, Dany." I am the dragon." She watched him, unsure. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but the words stayed locked in her throat. In her eyes, he saw not scorn but a gentle pity. That gentle pity enraged him more than open contempt ever could. He placed the egg back on the cloth. "If you truly respect House Targaryen, you will remember your place," he warned, rising to his feet. He meant to frighten her, to reclaim the authority that had slipped through his grasp. But the wind shifted, and her gaze hardened. She was no longer a child cowering in the corners of foreign mansions. The unspoken tension crackled in the air as the sky darkened. Rain began to patter softly, droplets rippling the surface of the river. Viserys walked away before the storm could drench him. His heart hammered, his mind a chorus of doubts and burning pride. He had the uneasy feeling that something was changing between them, an invisible boundary forming that he could not easily cross again. In the following weeks, that boundary became more pronounced. Daenerys rode at Khal Drogo's side, commanding a degree of respect from the Dothraki that Viserys found intolerable. She would speak to them in halting Dothraki words, forging connections he could not. Viserys' attempts to demand an army for his conquest of Westeros were met with disdain. He began to see that he was outmatched by the raw force of the Khal, that his illusions of immediate triumph were vain. But he clung to the belief that the dragons, once hatched, would make him unstoppable. He tried every technique he had read in half-remembered texts, singing ancient lullabies in High Valyrian, burying the eggs in hot sands, rubbing them with exotic oils. None of it stirred the slightest change, and each failure felt like a lash on his pride. Yet, the dreams continued, more vivid each time. Nights found him thrashing on his bedroll, tormented by visions of black wings and scorching flame. In these dreams he was wreathed in fire, a crown of flames dancing on his brow. Sometimes he would see the city of kings landing in the distance, its towers aflame, bells shattered. Other times, he soared above the clouds, riding a monstrous dragon with scales that rippled like living shadows. He woke breathless, uncertain if he was being guided by prophecy or lured by madness. One fateful day, the Khalasar reached Vaes Dothrak, the city sacred to the Dothraki people, nestled between two towering bronze stallions. There, custom dictated that even Khal Drogo himself would not spill blood. Yet Viserys' frustration only grew among the labyrinthine markets and the scent of incense. He spent hours pacing while Daenerys participated in the customary rites. If he dared raise his voice or show force, the other Dothraki, especially the crones of the Dosh Khaleen, would rebuke him. He felt cornered, ridiculed, stripped of the fear he wanted to inspire. He found himself itching for something reckless. The memory of that moment by the fire, when the black egg had almost shown him a glimpse of life, came flooding back. That night, under the pale glow of the moon, he stole into Daenerys' tent while she was away. He found the 3 eggs arranged in a place of honor, resting on a cloth of deep blue. The night was silent, all of Vaes Dothrak slumbering, except for a few wandering souls. Viserys took the eggs, one by one, and carried them out into the open desert beyond the city's borders. The air was cooler there, the starlight brilliant against the endless sky. The ground was dusty and cracked, scattered with sparse tufts of grass. A short distance away, jagged rocks formed a rough half-circle, like a natural amphitheater. Viserys placed the eggs in the center, building a small mound of stones around them. He struck flint, coaxing a flame to life from dried brush. The fire spread, gradually enveloping the eggs in flickering orange light. Viserys knelt before it, chanting in a low voice, half intoxicated with desperation and fervor. At first, the heat drew out glimmers across the egg shells. Viserys' heartbeat pounded in his ears. He recited the words he remembered from an old scroll, words about birth and rebirth, about the bond between Targaryen blood and dragon's flame. The flames leaped higher, dancing shadows across his face. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. He felt foolish, kneeling in the dust, risking the entire Khalasar's wrath for a fancy. But then a plume of sparks erupted from the center of the fire. The black egg shifted, its shell gleaming like obsidian. A small sound echoed, a crack, soft but undeniable. Viserys gasped. Adrenaline surged, flooding him with wild hope. He inched closer, ignoring the increasing heat. Another crack echoed, this time from the green egg. Fine lines appeared, spiderwebbing across its surface. His mouth went dry. He dared not blink, terrified that even a moment's lapse of devotion might cause the magic to fade. Flames licked hungrily, the heat growing intense. Beads of sweat gathered on Viserys' brow. In that instant, he thought of the stories. Targaryens were said to be blood of the dragon, able to endure fire like no other. He had always repeated that myth, but never tested it. Now, with everything on the line, he inched yet closer, ignoring the sting of heat against his skin. If the eggs were truly awakening, he had to be there, intimately part of their rebirth. The black egg cracked again, a piece of shell falling away to reveal the faint glimmer of something moist and alive beneath. Viserys felt tears burning in his eyes. This was it, the culmination of every dream, every night sweat terror, every ounce of pride that had kept him alive. He reached forward with shaking hands, ignoring the flame that seared his flesh. Smoke curled off his sleeves. He bit down on the inside of his cheek to keep from crying out. His body protested the heat, but his mind refused to relent. With trembling determination, he picked up the black egg from the flames. The shell crumbled as he lifted it, shedding fragments that crackled in the fire. Then something small and scaled unfolded within his palms, a serpentine neck, a pair of damp wings. It drew a first ragged breath of the night air. Viserys choked on a sob of triumph. He cradled the creature, which peered up at him with eyes that glowed like embers. Firelight glistened on its infant fangs. He turned his gaze to the green and cream eggs. They were cracking too, shells giving way to the new life thrashing within. Within moments, 2 more hatchlings squirmed out. One was a deep forest green with golden undertones, the other a pale cream streaked with silver. Both were small, delicate, and undeniably alive. Viserys could barely contain his exultation. He felt the raw sting of burns on his arms, but the searing pain was overridden by the euphoria of seeing dragons at last. He laughed wild and unsteady as he scooped up the other 2 hatchlings. His skin blistered where the flames licked him, yet the adrenaline flooding him was near divine. He held them, these tiny creatures that squeaked and clicked with mewling cries. A chaotic mix of paternal awe and unhinged ambition seized him. He had done it. He, Viserys Targaryen, not Daenerys, was the catalyst for this ancient magic. The prophecy was his to claim. Smoke drifted upward, carrying the scent of charred cloth and the tang of fresh life. Viserys rose unsteadily, cradling the dragons against his chest. The black one, largest of the trio, clung to his burned forearm, tiny claws digging into his flesh. The pain was excruciating, but he held still. These dragons were his future, the living embodiment of Targaryen resurgence. A voice behind him broke the hush. He spun, startled. Daenerys stood a few paces away, her expression indescribable, a mixture of disbelief, awe, and heartbreak. She had followed him, or perhaps she was drawn by the sight of flames in the night. Behind her, a cluster of Dothraki warriors watched in stunned silence, uncertain what they beheld. At the center of the smoldering circle, Viserys and the dragon hatchlings were bathed in flickering light. For a moment, brother and sister locked eyes. The tension that had been building between them for months, perhaps years, hung in the air, heavier than the smoke. Viserys felt the fury in Daenerys' gaze, but also the flicker of something else, a desperate longing. She had, in her own quiet way, believed in a future with these dragons. Now she saw them alive in her brother's arms, choosing him as the catalyst. Viserys broke the silence, his voice trembling with triumph. "They have awakened to me," he declared. He tried to stand straighter, despite the pain that scorched his skin. "I am their father, the true dragon." Daenerys took a hesitant step forward, eyes flicking to the hatchlings. She raised her hand as if she wanted to touch them, but she froze, uncertain if she had the right. The black hatchling hissed, a thin curl of smoke drifting from its tiny nostrils. Viserys smirked, though tears streaked his soot-smeared face. A hush fell over the Dothraki onlookers. Some fell to their knees, pressing foreheads to the ground, murmuring in their own tongue about fire made flesh, about the old powers returning. Others simply stared in shock, too stunned to kneel or speak. Viserys felt a surge of ecstasy. At long last he was no powerless beggar. He was a Targaryen in truth, with dragons to prove it. Daenerys' voice trembled. Viserys. How? He didn't let her finish. Because I am the dragon, Daenerys. Not you. His words cut sharper than he intended, fueled by months of frustration. It was never going to be you. You see now where your place truly is. She flinched. For a heartbeat, he saw her eyes glisten. Then her jaw tightened. Slowly, carefully, she lowered her outstretched hand. The green hatchling squirmed in Viserys' arms, but did not leap toward her. Instead, it pressed itself closer to him, as if recognizing him as the source of warmth. Viserys inhaled, ignoring the pain that stabbed through his chest. You tried to bind them to your will without even knowing how. They are Targaryen, yes, but they demand a living fire. I have waited all my life for this moment. Father was mad. But he believed in the old ways. He believed in the prophecy of our line. And I have realized it. Now the whole world will see. A gentle wind stirred, carrying away the last embers. The desert night pressed close. Stars watching from above. Daenerys said nothing more. She turned slowly, leaving Viserys standing in the glow of the dying fire. With the three dragons whimpering hungrily, he let out a shaky breath, feeling the stares of the Khalasar upon him. Let them stare. Let them witness. He had done what was impossible. That night, he limped back to his tent, ignoring the panic of the Dothraki around him. Some seemed to worship him as a chosen figure, while others feared him as a living heresy. Khal Drogo himself, upon hearing the commotion, arrived with firelight dancing across his braid. He gazed at Viserys with a mixture of alarm and respect. But even the mighty Khal seemed uncertain how to proceed in the face of actual living dragons. Viserys seized that uncertainty to carve a new path. Though his arms were blistered and raw, though exhaustion clung to every fiber, he felt an unquenchable surge of power. He declared that this was the sign he had promised, that he was the blood of the dragon returned to lead them to conquest. Words tumbled from his lips in a half-crazed mixture of common tongue and Dothraki dye. He brandished the hatchlings, ignoring their squeals. They were too young to breathe flame, but the notion of it alone made the gathered warriors stir with awe. He looked for Daenerys in that crowd, but she was gone, retreating into the shadows. If some part of him felt a pang of regret at how harshly he'd spoken to her, it was drowned out by the roar of triumph in his skull. He was the one who had awakened the dragons, and now his name would ring out across the world. In the days that followed, the city of Vaes Dothrak was abuzz with rumors. Some claimed Viserys had sold his soul to dark magics. Others said he was a living god. The Dosh Khaleen eyed him with suspicion and reverence, uncertain whether to accept this phenomenon or condemn it. Khal Drogo, though unsettled by the breach in tradition, recognized the potential in such a display. If these dragons grew to adulthood, who could stand against them? For now, they were tiny, helpless creatures that demanded constant attention and raw meat to feed on. Viserys rose to the occasion with feverish devotion, feeding them morsels of half-cooked goat flesh, ignoring the savage pecks at his already burned hands. He endured the pain as though it were a sacred rite. Whenever Daenerys ventured near, the hatchlings shrank away from her, hissing softly. It tore at her heart, and Viserys felt a twisted satisfaction. Though part of him still cared for her, a greater part had been consumed by the intoxicating rush of success. He had claimed his birthright. She had no place in it, beyond serving as his subject. She tried once to approach him late at night, in the flicker of candles, in a large tent the Dothraki had gifted him. She stood at the threshold, her hair unbound, her eyes pleading. But Viserys simply cradled the black hatchling in his arms, stroking its tiny horns. He barely spared Daenerys a glance. In the end, she left without a word. Pain from the burns often left Viserys shaking, but he refused to show weakness in front of the Khalasar Dun. Instead, he poured all his energy into forging a bond with these newborn dragons. He could feel it growing day by day, a faint echo of their sensations, their hunger, their fear. They were too young to fly. Their wings were spindly, translucent in certain spots. But they could crawl and cling to his shoulders, and sometimes they nipped at each other, squabbling for the best position on his warmth. It was almost comical, if it were not so perilous, to see him struggle to corral the trio within his tent. He would snap at any Dothraki who tried to help, for only he could handle them without incessant shrieks. Gradually, Khal Drogo's deference became evident. The Khal might not kneel, but he looked at Viserys with a new respect, as though he recognized a power that transcended raw muscle. Through interpreters, Drogo asked if the new Dragon Lord would lead them across the Salt Sea one day to plunder the so-called iron chairs of the distant land. Viserys proud declared that they would sail to Westeros, that he would reclaim the Seven Kingdoms as his birthright. The Dothraki roared in approval, though many remained apprehensive. They had never feared any man, but a man with dragons was another matter entirely. Viserys reveled in this shift. He walked through V's Dothrak as if it were his palace, letting the black hatchling cling to his shoulder, the green perched on a makeshift roost near his tent, and the cream and silver one nestled often near his chest. He wore his burns like a badge of honor, flinching only when he was alone. Each day he felt more certain that a grand destiny had chosen him. The House Targaryen's fortunes might finally be on the rise. But in quiet corners of his mind, a whisper of unease remained. The second phase of any Targaryen's triumph was forging unity, or fear among his allies. If Daenerys rebelled or refused to submit, it could sow discord among the Dothraki. Already, some of the Bloodriders expressed reservations. They muttered that a man who let his sister wander in sorrow did not understand Kalaka or familial bonds. But Viserys dismissed their concerns. He had no time for the meddling of those who didn't grasp the burden of prophecy. Meanwhile, Daenerys grew more distant. He caught glimpses of her in the marketplace of V's Dothrak, speaking to the old crones of the Dosh Khaleen in hushed tones. She seemed to be learning from them, absorbing secrets he could not guess. Khal Drogo watched her from afar, measuring her with dark eyes. Once, Viserys saw Drogo place a hand on Daenerys' belly, as if checking for signs of a child. That notion made Viserys clench his fists. A Targaryen child born of a Dothraki warlord might complicate things, but then he reminded himself that he was the one with dragons. No child could compete with that living symbol of power. Still, as the days crept on, an odd tension hovered between brother and sister. Neither confronted the other, not openly. Viserys relished his triumph, while Daenerys seemed to tread carefully, as though awaiting some inevitable confrontation. Perhaps she hoped to sway him with gentle words, or perhaps she feared the savage side he had displayed. The dragons thrived on raw meat, and the near-constant attention Viserys lavished upon them. Sometimes he walked them through the outskirts of V's Dothrak in the early morning, letting them stretch their fledgling wings in the crisp air. The black one was the boldest, snapping at passing insects, and occasionally at Dothraki hounds that ventured too close. The green one was sly, creeping behind rocks and launching playful ambushes. The cream and silver was gentler, occasionally letting out soft chirps that almost sounded like purrs. Viserys was enthralled by their every quirk, reading significance into each motion. At night he would collapse from weariness, his arms swathed in ointments the Dothraki healers provided. Yet the moment he closed his eyes, he dreamt of flight, of perched dragons on the high walls of King's Landing, of a city trembling under the return of Targaryen rule. He saw the throne room, the Iron Throne with its twisted swords glinting in torchlight, and he saw himself ascending those steps, each echoing footfall resonating with unstoppable finality. No longer would the name Targaryen be spat upon or derided as madness. It would be revered. When he woke, the pain of the burns reminded him that his path was no dream. He was forging it, step by step, forging it in blood and flame. He resolved that soon, very soon, he would have the Khalasar cross the sea to invade Westeros. The dragons were young, yes, but the mere rumor of them might shatter the morale of his enemies. He imagined the lords of the Seven Kingdoms trembling at the thought of dragonfire, once again scorching their fields. He had no doubt some old Targaryen loyalists would flock to his banner the moment they knew a true dragon had returned. As he rose each morning to feed his hatchlings, he muttered to them, "We go home soon." The black one often hissed in response as if it understood. The notion filled Viserys with fierce joy. However, behind the euphoria, a subtle tension crackled in the air. Daenerys no longer came near, but the weight of her presence lingered. The Dashkaleen accepted her as a Khaleesi, and if she bore a son, the child could be a powerful figure among the Horse Lords. Would that threaten his newly won power? Viserys tried to push the worry aside. He was the father of dragons, a living symbol that transcended the traditions of the Dothraki. Khal Drogo might lead the riders in war, but Viserys would be the unstoppable force that guaranteed victory. If Daenerys wanted to remain at the Khal's side, bearing his children, so be it, as long as she did not stand in his way. Yet in quiet hours, a memory gnawed at him, the look on his sister's face when she saw the hatchlings in his arms, the heartbreak and longing, the sense that part of her believed she too was meant for this. He told himself she was wrong, that only one Targaryen could fulfill such a monumental destiny. But the flicker of her sorrow haunted him nonetheless. Sometimes, when the black dragon chirped softly at him, he found himself recalling how, as children, the only comfort in exile had been each other's presence. Now that comfort had turned into an unbridgeable rift, with dragons at the center. More than once, Viserys woke in a cold sweat from nightmares where Daenerys was wreathed in fire, walking through flames unscathed, the dragons flocking to her. He shook those visions off as delusions. The dragons had chosen him. He had been the one who risked the flames that night. Daenerys was simply an onlooker. Still, he wondered why his dreams seemed determined to show him otherwise. Despite such lingering fears, the dawn of his new reign appeared on the horizon. He could taste it, like copper in the air. The Dothraki muttered that the sea crossing was cursed, but enough warriors seemed convinced that following Viserys might lead to unimaginable plunder and glory. Khal Drogo's eyes gleamed with a quiet calculation, as if analyzing the best time to gather ships and cross. Rumors spread that other Dothraki, Khalasars, would soon arrive in Vaes Dothrak, some to pay homage, others to challenge. Conflict loomed, and Viserys intended to meet it with dragons at his side. Every time the black hatchling spread its tiny wings, testing the air, Viserys imagined a day when those wings would be as wide as a galleon's sails, strong enough to carry him above the walls of a city ripe for conquest. Patience, he told himself, though he had never been good at it. Patience, for the true Targaryen hour was near. He vowed that when the time came to cross the narrow sea, he would lead not as a beggar but as a conqueror. He would reclaim the throne stolen from his father, wash away the shame of exile, and ensure that the Targaryen legacy, his legacy, would burn brighter than it ever had. All it would take was a spark, a flame, and a final test of will. The dragons were born. Now the fire would spread. Viserys told himself, with every painful beat of his pulse, that this was only the beginning. He was the father of dragons, the living promise of Valyria reborn. He was no longer a frightened boy clutching a ceremonial sword in the corridors of a burning red keep. He was fire made flesh, awakened by destiny's call, and whatever stood between him and the Iron Throne would burn in dragon flame. Viserys Targaryen woke well before dawn each day, rousing to an ache in his arms so deep it felt carved into the bone. He had refused further bandages after the first few days, determined to display his burns as a badge of honor. The flesh on his forearms remained an angry red, shiny with ointment. But he would not hide the price he paid for bringing dragons back to the world. The Khalasar had never seen such a marvel as these living, squealing hatchlings, and Viserys felt his heart brim with the power of that reverence. He emerged from his tent into the cool pre-dawn air. The black hatchling clung to his shoulder, its small claws not as painfully sharp as they were at first, but still enough to pinch his skin. The creature felt heavier every morning, as if it grew before his eyes. He'd taken to calling it Naharza in the old Valyrian tradition, meaning night's roar, though the name was known only to him. He was still deciding whether to reveal such titles to the Khalasar, or hold them as his private secret. a bond shared with the dragons and no one else. A pair of Dothraki warriors stood guard near his tent. Their braids were thick with bells, and they eyed him with expressions teetering between awe and unease. Viserys smirked. Every time he saw that flicker of uncertainty, a warm satisfaction curled in his chest. Let them stand in wonder, he thought. Let them question how a silver-haired foreigner could cradle living flames in his hands. By the time they finished asking themselves that, he would be on the shores of Westeros, carving his way to the throne. He walked past them without a word, the black hatchling sniffing the air. The two younger dragons, Green and Cream, remained in the shelter of the tent, dozing in a bed of soft furs. Of the trio, Naharza had been the first to hatch and the quickest to bond, always perched on Viserys' shoulder. It hissed softly when one of the Dothraki guards twitched as if to follow, forcing the warrior to freeze in place. Viserys let out a low chuckle and strode onward, the grasses parting before him. Vaes Dothrak sprawled beyond a ridge, its ancient monuments and towering idols faint silhouettes in the half-light. A hush lay over the city at this hour. Even the crones of the Dosh Khaleen slept, content that the night would keep them safe. The smoldering remains of the previous evening's fires dotted the horizon, sending tendrils of smoke into the sky. Viserys preferred this pre-sunrise quiet. It was as if the world held its breath for him. He made his way to the edge of a shallow stream that glinted silver under the moon's lingering glow. The grasses here were thicker, damp with dew. He knelt and let the black dragon crawl down to the bank, slithering on its belly like an ungainly cat. "Drink," Viserys murmured. "We have much to do." Naharza dipped its narrow snout, lapping at the water in quick darting motions, then flicked its tongue as if surprised by the cold. Viserys watched with fascination. He still felt that sense of delirious wonder that he, and not Daenerys, had brought these beasts forth. Even the pain he endured seemed trivial next to that glorious truth. The old texts claimed dragon lords needed a mutual bond with their mounts, and Viserys felt he had proven himself in flame. That bond, he told himself, would only deepen in time. At length, the sky began to lighten. Pink and orange rays streaked across the horizon, and with them came distant murmurs of the waking Khalasar. Horses neighed, tents rustled, and the faint clang of metal drifted on the breeze. Viserys straightened, the black hatchling crawling back up his sleeve to perch near his collarbone. He turned toward the gathering swirl of activity in Vaes Dothrak, noting the shadows of many riders converging. Some new Khalasars, perhaps? Word had spread across the Dothraki Sea that miracles had occurred here, that a man walked with dragons. Some would come to pay homage, others to challenge. A part of him bristled at the idea of challengers, but a more calculating side welcomed it. If lesser Khals arrived and saw dragons with their own eyes, they might swear fealty, rather than risk a direct fight. The Dothraki respected strength above all else, and what greater strength existed than the blood of the dragon made real? He would use their worship to fuel his next steps. He returned to his tent to gather the other two hatchlings. They stirred at his approach, squeaking and snapping tiny jaws. He bent to scoop them up, ignoring the bite of their claws. The cream-colored one squawked hungrily, and he smiled as he fed it a morsel of dried goat from a nearby bowl. The green dragon butted its wedge-shaped head against his burnt forearm, demanding equal attention. Viserys obliged, though he grimaced as the ointment-slick skin chafed. "You'll eat well soon enough," he told them, his tone reverent. "And then, we fly." Of course, that day was far off. Dragons did not grow to rideable size overnight. They were fragile in these first weeks, prone to all manner of hazards. But every day they grew bolder, their wings thicker, their cries more forceful. Viserys felt a heady rush at the thought that one day they would tower over men and beasts alike. If anyone dared question his right to the Seven Kingdoms, they would face living proof of his lineage. He ordered one of the Dothraki thralls to fetch fresh water. He rarely tried to speak their tongue, though he understood scattered words. Instead, he pointed imperiously, signaling his demands. A moment later, 2 clay pitchers were brought to him. Another thrall entered, depositing strips of raw horse meat in a shallow bowl. The dragon smelled the blood and clambered toward it, squealing in anticipation. Viserys carefully let them feed, mindful not to let them scuffle. He noticed the black one always took the largest share. He found that fitting, a reflection of its older, fiercer spirit. Outside, footfalls broke his concentration. The flap of the tent swung aside, revealing Khal Drogo. A hush fell. The enormous warlord stood with one of his blood riders, both scanning the interior with dark, assessing eyes. Behind them hovered a swirl of curious Dothraki, no doubt drawn by the constant chatter of the miraculous beasts. Khal Drogo's gaze landed on Viserys' shoulder, where the black dragon had just finished gulping a chunk of meat. Its tiny muzzle was stained red. Drogo let out a low rumble of approval. To Viserys' surprise, the Khal approached with deliberate care, as though trying not to spook the creatures. Viserys rose, ignoring the twinge in his arms. He lifted his chin. "Khal Drogo," he said in the common tongue. "You see how they thrive." The Khal nodded. His own voice rumbled in Dothraki. The translator, an older woman in rough-spun robes, stepped forward. "The Khal says the city is filling with riders. He says you have asked them to see this wonder of yours." Viserys allowed himself a thin smile. "Let them come. When they behold what I have wrought, they will know the time has come to cross the sea." "There." The translator's eyes flicked to the dragons warily. "The Khal says the riders will want to witness your strength. They may wish to see if a man who hatches fire can bleed." A prickle of unease went through Viserys' spine. He studied Drogo's face, trying to parse his intent. The Khal's expression was unreadable, a mask of stoic power. Viserys forced himself not to show hesitation. "Let them try," he said, lifting the black dragon's head gently so the beast hissed in the Khal's direction. "They will find my strength considerable." Khal Drogo let out a quick bark of laughter, stepping closer. Without preamble, he extended his hand. The black dragon bared its fangs, a row of needle-like teeth. But Drogo didn't flinch. He remained still until Naharza quieted. Then, with surprising delicacy, the Khal stroked the crest of the dragon's head. It let out a wary chirp, but did not snap. Viserys watched, torn between pride and resentment. Part of him wanted these creatures to accept no hand but his. And yet, forging a bond with Drogo served his ambitions. If the Khal believed in his power, if he saw a future in these scaled hatchlings, he would remain an invaluable ally in crossing the sea. Drogo murmured something that needed no translation. The tone was one of admiration. Then he turned and strode out of the tent, beckoning Viserys to follow. Outside, a swirl of morning light revealed the growing throng of Dothraki. Viserys counted the distinct sigils and banners fluttering in the breeze, marking different khalasars that had gathered from the far corners of the grass sea. The shapes and colors were unfamiliar, but their presence was undeniable. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands, more than before. They had come for a spectacle, and Viserys would provide it. He let out a sharp whistle, calling over one of his newly acquired servants. "Bring me the carrying basket," he ordered, switching to the common tongue out of habit. The boy, not quite grasping his words, quirked his head. Viserys repeated himself with an imperious gesture, until finally the boy nodded and rushed away. Shortly thereafter, he returned with a sturdy woven basket, lined with cloth. Viserys placed the green and cream dragons inside, making sure they wouldn't scratch each other. The black one, as ever, rode on his shoulder, tail curling around his neck. A ring of Dothraki parted for him as he stepped forward. He sensed their eyes crawling over his burns, the regal set of his chin, and of course the living proof of his extraordinary claim, perched near his collarbone. Some frowned in doubt, others bowed their heads in a gesture of acceptance. The crowd was so thick that moving through it felt like wading through a living sea. He followed in Khal Drogo's wake, the tall warlord cutting a path across Vaes Dothrak's main thoroughfare. Colossal statues of gods from forgotten cities loomed overhead, pockmarked by centuries of wind-blown sand. Everywhere Viserys looked, riders whispered or pointed. He marveled at how quickly gossip carried across these plains. Words like Dracarys and Zorvezeric, Valyrian and Dothraki variants, mixed in the air references to dragons. Viserys wondered which rumor they believed, that he had stolen the soul of a god. that he was a demon from beyond the red wastes, or that he was a promised savior, come to lead them into a new age. In his mind, the last option suited him best. At length, the procession arrived at a wide clearing flanked by towering pillars carved in the shape of rearing horses. The ground here was packed dirt, flattened by generations of Dothraki gatherings. Sizable tents and open pavilions circled the space, forming something of an amphitheater. Already, the stands teemed with onlookers, Dothraki warriors in leather vests and swirling tattoos, wizened elders, bare-chested youths eager for excitement. Sunlight beat down, glaring off polished steel araks. Khal Drogo halted at the center, turning to face the new arrivals. 4 other Khals approached from different directions, each accompanied by their blood riders. Their braids were thick with gold or silver bells, chiming faintly as they walked. One among them, tall and wiry, gave Viserys a look of barely veiled scorn. Another, older, with streaks of gray in his hair, studied the dragons with rapt fascination. Viserys suppressed a sneer, reminding himself to appear regal, unshakable. He set the basket down on a wooden table that had been placed in the center of the clearing. Carefully, he lifted the green and cream hatchlings out and let them crawl across the surface, squeaking at the unfamiliar environment. The black one hopped down from his shoulder, wings flaring to maintain balance. A hush fell as hundreds of eyes fixed on these small living shapes, shimmering in the sun. The tall, wiry Khal scowled, stepping closer. He muttered a few curt sentences in Dothraki. Khal Drogo answered with a single rumbling phrase, then nodded toward Viserys. The translator at Drogo's side spoke, voice echoing in the quiet. He says they wish to see if the fire is real, if you can show them the beast's flame. Viserys resisted a moment of panic. The hatchlings were still so small. They had barely begun to cough up little spurts of smoke. Could they conjure flame on command? He swallowed, glancing at the black one, which snapped at the empty air. "Bring me tinder and dry grass," he called out. Some of the onlookers shifted, uncertain. "Now," he barked. After a tense pause, a group of youths rushed forward with a bundle of dried grasses and sticks. Viserys placed the tinder in a small pit that had been dug in the earth, presumably for such demonstrations. He picked up the black dragon, resting its belly across his arm, and guided its snout toward the grass. It squirmed, uncertain, but he steadied it with a firm grip. In a soft voice, he crooned a Valyrian phrase he had read in fragments of old scrolls, a coaxing to call forth the dragon's flame. The black hatchling emitted a frustrated chirp, more agitation than true heat. Viserys felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. The crowd stirred, restless. "Come on," he whispered, ignoring the dull ache in his arms. "Show them." As though sensing his urgency, the tiny dragon's throat vibrated. A thin wisp of smoke curled from between its jaws. Then, abruptly, it sneezed a spark into the grass. Small tongues of flame crackled to life. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Viserys let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The black hatchling, startled by its own display, let out a sharp squeal. He set it down gently on the table, and it scampered away from the fire, glaring at the flickering embers, as if offended. Still, that brief spark was enough. A hush spread through the gathering, and awe lit the faces of even the doubters. The tall, wiry Khal stared hard at the newborn creature, then at Viserys, as if trying to reconcile the improbable sight with the laws of the world. Khal Drogo crossed his arms over his broad chest, a hint of a grin ghosting his lips. Viserys didn't hesitate to seize the moment. "You have seen it," he declared, raising his voice so all could hear. "These dragons are reborn in my blood. I am their father, as the line of Aegon the Conqueror once was. In Westeros, the Iron Throne was built by dragon's fire. My father lost it to traitors, but now the dragons have returned to reclaim what is ours." He paused, letting the translator echo his words in Dothraki. The stony faces before him began to shift, some to grudging respect, others to cautious excitement. He pressed on, exultation rising in his throat. "You are riders, conquerors, fearless in the face of death. Join me, and we shall cross the sea to plunder the greatest cities of the West. Gold, jewels, slaves, all shall be yours. No wall can hold back dragons. Follow me, and every rider will be as a king across the narrow sea." When the translator finished, a roar of voices erupted. Some shouted in what might have been agreement, others bellowed challenges. More than a few, men and women alike, seemed to be calling for a demonstration of Viserys' own strength. The old traditions demanded that if he wished to be seen as a leader, he had to face those who would contest him. Khal Drogo stepped forward, his voice booming. He gestured to Viserys, then to the throng, and the translator called out, "The Khal says, any who doubt the dragon's flame may face him in combat." Viserys' stomach clenched. His grip on the table's edge tightened, ignoring the stinging in his burns. He had never been a great swordsman, certainly no match for a seasoned Dothraki blood rider in single combat. But the alternative, refusing, would brand him a coward, undermining everything. A wave of dizziness washed over him as the tall, wiry Khal barked something. Stepping closer. Clearly, he aimed to test the so-called Dragon Prince. Blood pounded in Viserys' ears. He glanced at his hatchlings, their tiny forms huddled on the table. This was too soon, too raw. Yet the Dothraki demanded proof of a warrior's spirit. Could he bank on intimidation alone to spare him the fight? He ground his teeth. Perhaps the black hatchling's demonstration of fire would stay this Khal's hand. But the wiry Khal's sneer made it clear. A demonstration wouldn't be enough. The man unsheathed an arak, its curved blade catching the sunlight in a menacing gleam. Viserys had one hand free, while the other cradled the cream dragon. The crowd shifted, forming a ring. The hush that fell was terrible in its intensity. Khal Drogo's gaze flicked from the challenger to Viserys. Measuring, waiting. If Viserys was truly to lead, Drogo would not shield him from this test. The older Khal, the one with grain in his braid, folded his arms. The tension was palpable enough to cut. Viserys swallowed. The translator echoed the wiry Khal's words, cold and blunt. "He says he does not fear a child with lizards. He says he will spill your blood and claim the scaled beasts for himself." A flash of panic spiked in Viserys' chest, but anger rose just as quickly. How dare anyone speak of his dragons as lizards, as mere beasts to be claimed? He lifted his chin, slipping the cream dragon into the basket. Then he stepped around the table, ignoring the protests of the green one squeaking behind him. The black remained perched, its tail twitching in agitation. "Bring me a weapon," he demanded. A hush, then a young Dothraki stepped forward with a curved arak. Viserys gripped the hilt, feeling the unfamiliar weight. He had trained briefly with blades and pentos, though never enough to earn skill. He was no knight, no blood rider. Sweat slicked his palms, but he refused to yield. The words of his father's madness buzzed in his head. "I am the dragon." The wiry Khal gave a mocking grin, then lunged. Viserys jerked back, the edge of the blade whistling inches from his throat. A collective gasp rippled through the throng. He steadied his stance, heart pounding so violently he thought it might burst from his chest. They circled him, arak raised. Viserys tried to recall the posture of the Braavosi water dancers he had once observed, but his arms felt heavy, his legs stiff. A snarl distorted the Khal's face, and he lunged again. Viserys managed to parry, though his burn-racked arms flared in agony. Sparks flew where the steel met. The Khal hammered at his blade, testing his strength, forcing Viserys backward. He staggered, struggling to keep his footing. The crowd jeered, some calling for a swift kill. Others cheered for the dragon man to show his fire. Time slowed. The Khal aimed a blow at Viserys' shoulder. Viserys twisted aside, barely avoiding the strike. Pain shot up his side as the move tugged on his burns. He hissed, gripping his arak so tightly his knuckles turned white. A sliver of fear whispered that he was outmatched. This Dothraki had likely spilled blood since boyhood. Then his gaze landed on Naharza, the black hatchling perched on the table behind the Khal, hissing wildly. A desperate idea formed in Viserys' mind. If the dragons were truly bound to him, perhaps they would intervene. But they were so small. Could they do more than startle the man? Another quick slash from the cowl demanded his attention. Viserys ducked. Pain exploded as the cowl's blade nicked his left forearm, slicing through burnt flesh. Blood spattered the dusty ground. A roar of triumph went up from the challenger. Viserys stumbled, dropping to a knee. A wave of dizziness threatened to overwhelm him as he stared at the blood streaming from the wound. He heard the black dragon screech, saw it spread its wings in agitation, but it was too small to do real harm. The cowl bared his teeth, stepping in to finish the job. Viserys forced down the pain and fear. He was the father of dragons. He would not die on this dusty field. As the cowl's blade descended, Viserys flung himself forward, slamming the arak upward. The angle was awkward, but the tip of his blade sliced across the cowl's forearm. Blood spurted. The man hissed, momentarily off balance. The crowd shouted, surging closer. Another breath, another move. Viserys, surging with adrenaline, pivoted on his knee and slashed toward the cowl's exposed flank. He felt the blade bite into flesh. The wiry man howled and stumbled sideways, dropping to a crouch, disbelief etched on his face. Before he could recover, Viserys mustered the last of his strength and swung the arak in a downward arc. The blade caught the man's throat, spraying the dust with blood. A collective gasp, then silence. The cowl's body collapsed in the dirt, eyes wide with shock. Viserys sagged, chest heaving, knees threatening to give out. His left arm flared with white-hot agony. The black hatchling screeched again, flapping its wings. Khal Drogo stood solemn, arms folded. One of the other Khals spat in the dirt, as if lamenting the fallen man's weakness. A trembling hush spread before the thunder of voices erupted once more. Some of the Dothraki knelt, pressing their foreheads to the ground. Others stared, impressed or appalled. The translator raised her arms to calm them. "He has proven his blood rider strength," she called out in Dothraki. "He is no frail beggar but a dragon made flesh." Viserys clutched his wounded arm, his breath ragged. Blood trickled between his fingers, painting the burned skin a garish red. He forced himself to stand, ignoring the dizziness. He had to appear unbreakable. "I told you," he gasped, raising the arak high though the weight of it felt crushing. "We Targaryens are fire and blood." Applause erupted, mingled with chanting. Some Dothraki pounded the butts of their spears against the earth. Khal Drogo strode forward, clasped Viserys' free hand, and raised it high. A wave of excitement rippled through the amphitheater. This was the seal of acceptance from a mighty Khal. The other Khals exchanged uneasy looks, but none dared challenge him immediately. "Shall we cross the sea? Blood of my blood?" Drogo's deep voice carried, even without translation. Viserys forced a laugh, though it sounded strained and breathless. "Yes," he managed, swallowing hard as pain tore through him. "Yes, we sail soon." With the dragons leading the way, the Dothraki roared in approval, and the noise echoed off the ancient pillars. Viserys tried not to collapse. Someone rushed forward with a strip of cloth to bind his wound. Khal Drogo's presence shielded him from onlookers while he caught his breath. He felt delirious, the mixture of agony and triumph swirling like a fever in his veins. The black dragon leapt from the table onto his shoulder again, squawking as if scolding him for nearly losing. By the time the morning sun climbed higher, the amphitheater had become a place of festivities. Drums beat, and the Dothraki exulted in the spectacle of blood and fire. The other two dragons, frightened by the noise, cowered in the basket, occasionally peering out. Viserys let them be. He had proven enough for one day. Now, he needed rest, and to ensure the entire city knew of this victory. He retreated to his tent, the throng parting for him like a tide. Some reached out to touch him or the dragons, but the black hatchling hissed, driving them back. He managed to keep his bearing until he crossed the threshold, then sank onto a low cushion. Pain raged through his wounds, and his vision swam with each heartbeat. Dothraki healers arrived with steaming bowls of herbal salves. They spoke in hushed tones, applying poultices to stop the bleeding. Viserys clenched his jaw. Stifling groans. The black dragon climbed onto a makeshift perch, unsettled. Outside, the cheers continued. a dull roar pressing at the canvas walls. Suddenly, the tent flap rustled, revealing Daenerys. She stood there, eyes wide, her expression a tumult of emotions. Fear, relief, anger. Her braided hair glimmered in the sunlight. She saw the blood-staining Viserys' bandages, the bruises on his burnt arms. For a moment, she hesitated, as though unsure if she'd be turned away. Viserys, weak from blood loss, met her gaze. He wanted to hurl a scornful remark, to reassert the gulf between them. But the fight had left him raw. She stepped closer, ignoring the hiss of the black hatchling. One of the healers murmured that she should stay back, but she waved him off and knelt beside Viserys. Without a word, she grasped the cloth strips the healers had wrapped around his injured arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. Viserys flinched, only now realizing how exhausted he was. She examined the wound, brow furrowing. Then she touched his forehead with the back of her hand. "You're feverish," she said quietly. He jerked away, though he lacked the strength to be forceful. "I'm fine," he bit out. Quaver in his voice betrayed him. "I don't need your pity." She lowered her eyes unoffended. "Let me help," she said softly but firmly. She glanced at the healers, gestured for a bowl of water and a clean cloth. They obeyed, likely because she was still the Cowl's Khaleesi. Viserys glared, but when she pressed the cool cloth to his burning face, he did not resist. He was too drained to continue the charade. "You killed a cow," Daenerys whispered as she dabbed away dried blood from the edge of his mouth. "That will make you a legend among them." He coughed a humorless laugh. "Or a threat." His eyes flicked to the black dragon perched overhead. "But I have these. They won't dare strike me now. I am the father of dragons, the rightful king." His voice trailed into a ragged sigh. She nodded, not disputing it. For a few moments she worked in silence, cleaning and rewrapping the wound with more skill than he expected. Her brow was knitted with concern. Viserys felt a pang, recalling how once long ago they had been close, bound by the loss of their home. But that was before the dragons, before everything changed. Once the bandages were redone, Daenerys leaned back. The black hatchling hopped down from its perch, circling her warily. She watched it, her eyes reflecting a flicker of longing. Carefully, she extended her hand. The creature hissed, inching away, but Viserys caught the subtle shift in its stance. It was less aggressive than before. Perhaps in his weakened state, it sensed Daenerys' quiet presence as less of a threat. She turned to him, speaking in a near whisper. "I want to see them grow," she said, a plea in her voice. "I want to see the dragons fill the sky, Viserys. I wish I could share that dream with you." He swallowed. For a moment, he considered letting her be part of it. She was still Targaryen blood after all. But a sudden rush of anger lanced through him. How many times had he been overlooked, overshadowed, made to feel small compared to the whispered prophecies about her? How many times had men in pentos or magisters in lies hinted that the power of their house might rest in Daenerys, not him? Yet here he was, with dragons in his blood, proving them all wrong. He mustered a bitter scowl. "They are mine," he said, voice taut. "Never forget that." She flinched as though he'd struck her. Then she stood, the cool cloth in her hand forgotten. A flicker of defiance tightened her features, but she swallowed whatever words she might have hurled back. Instead, she turned away from him, brushing past the startled healers, and left the tent. Viserys' exhaustion overwhelmed him. He slumped against the cushions, wincing at the pain in his side. The black hatchling crawled nearer, nuzzling his neck like a concerned cat. He closed his eyes, letting the murmured chatter of the healers wash over him. They spoke of how the city would feast tonight, celebrating the victory of the dragon-blooded man. He drifted in and out of fevered dreams. Images of soaring over endless plains, the roars of dragons shaking the air. Then the vision shifted. He saw a woman wreathed in flames, silver hair blowing in a hot wind, unscathed by the fire swirling around her. He wanted to reach out, to see if it was Daenerys or perhaps his mother, but the dream crumbled. In its place, he heard the sound of bells ringing, the memory of King's Landing on that final day. He saw men in red cloaks, Lannister soldiers, barging through corridors. He smelled smoke and tasted ashes. Then, as if from nowhere, a great shadow crossed the sky. Dragon wings blotted the sun. He gasped awake to the gloom of the tent. Evening had fallen. A single torch burned near the entrance, casting flickering shadows on the canvas walls. The black dragon still perched at his side, dozing with its head tucked under a wing. The green and cream ones lay curled in the basket, their soft breathing almost inaudible. Outside, he heard raucous voices, the Dothraki celebrating with drink, dancing, and perhaps savage horse races under the moonlight. When he tried to rise, pain tore through him. He hissed, pressing a hand to his bandaged wound. Even so, he forced himself up, refusing to remain flat on his back like an invalid. If the city was feasting in his name, he had to show himself, to ensure that the momentum of this triumph did not slip away. Every hour counted if he intended to rally a force large enough to conquer Westeros. He summoned a servant, a young girl with wide, dark eyes, and told her to fetch water, wine, and a fresh tunic. She bowed and hurried off. Viserys took in his reflection in a polished brass plate near the bedding. His hair clung to his sweat-damp face and his eyes were bloodshot. He looked half mad, half dead, but there was also a pride in his posture, a feral determination. He had killed a Khal in single combat. Weak though it may have been, he had hatched dragons. No matter how battered he appeared, the people outside would remember that. When the girl returned, he drank greedily from a water pitcher, then washed his face with the damp cloth. She helped him slip into a loose-fitting tunic of pale silk, one that wouldn't aggravate his burns and bandages. The black dragon stirred, blinking at the disturbance, then fluttered onto his shoulder as if claiming its usual spot. Viserys allowed a small smirk. Yes, it's time to greet our subjects. He left the tent, wincing as the torchlit dusk greeted him with a burst of noise. Bonfires dotted the central squares of V's, Dothrak Gotok. Drums thundered in a pulse that reverberated through the ground. Dothraki warriors whirled in frenzied dances, while others feasted on spiced meats and potent liquors. Figures parted as Viserys limped past, some bowing their heads, others nodding in recognition. A few voices called out, Vesh Ahanayo, some kind of Dothraki phrase praising prowess in battle. The language barrier kept him from fully understanding, but their tone was approving. He reached a large fire ring where Khal Drogo and several other Khals reclined on cushions. Bowls of fermented mare's milk and heaps of roasted goat were spread out on low tables. The moment Drogo spotted Viserys, he beckoned him over and offered him a horn brimming with strong wine. Viserys took it, raising it in a silent toast before drinking. The flavor was harsh, but he needed the warmth in his stomach to mask the pain. Drogo murmured a few words, and the translator offered a hesitant smile. The Khal says you are strong to walk so soon. He respects your courage. Viserys inclined his head. My thanks, he said stiffly. He sank onto a cushion with as much grace as he could manage, gingerly resting his injured arm in his lap. The black hatchling surveyed the scene, its head whipping toward the sizzling meats on the spit. Viserys plucked a piece of half-charred flesh and held it out, chuckling as the little creature devoured it with greedy snaps. He felt the weight of the other Khals' stares. No doubt they were still grappling with the truth of these dragons. The older one, with gray streaks in his braid, spoke in low Dothraki, gesturing at the black hatchling's shining scales. The translator relayed, He asks if these beasts will fight for you as they grow. He wonders if they will carry you across the skies. Viserys met the man's gaze, letting a faint smile curl his lips. They will, he said simply. One day, we will soar over continents, and all who defy us shall burn. In the dancing firelight, he saw the flicker of excitement that lit the older Khal's eyes. This was precisely what so many Dothraki yearned for. Glory, unlike any found in the steppe raids. Drogo grunted in agreement, slapping Viserys on the shoulder. The blow rattled him, causing a fresh bolt of pain to shoot through his side, but he forced a grin, unwilling to show weakness. The feast continued. Musicians plucked at strange, stringed instruments, and warriors boasted of raids past. Viserys noticed more than a few warlike glances cast in his direction, as though men measured whether to challenge him for the dragons. But the memory of the day's combat still hung in the air like a warning. For now, he was safe. At one point, the revelers made space for a series of contests. Knife throwing, tests of strength, even a precarious duel fought on a narrow wooden beam. Dothraki jeered and cheered, placing bets with coin, trinkets, or stolen jewelry from far-off cities. Viserys watched with distant fascination. He could not help imagining how the lords and ladies of Westeros would react to such savage displays. Would they scoff at the Dothraki's raw brutality? Or would they tremble, recalling the unstoppable might of dragons? He drank more wine, letting the buzz numb his pain. The black dragon, perhaps sensing his exhaustion, nuzzled closer, tucking its wings against his neck. He offered it occasional scraps of meat, indulging its growing appetite. The other two hatchlings remained in a guarded part of the feast, looked after by a pair of Drogo's trusted men. Viserys knew he couldn't carry all three everywhere, not in his condition. Even so, he checked on them often, ensuring they were fed and safe. As the night deepened, Daenerys' absence became more noticeable. He caught a glimpse of her once, across the plaza, speaking quietly with the Dosh Khaleen, those ancient crones who interpreted omens. Their conversation looked intense, but he couldn't discern its subject. The crones seemed to treat her with a mixture of reverence and curiosity. He wondered what they were telling her, or what secrets she might be gleaning. A coil of unease twisted in him, but he reminded himself that she posed no threat to his dragons. They answered to him alone. Eventually, Khal Drogo announced in a booming voice that preparations must begin. Even with all these men, crossing the sea was an unprecedented undertaking for the Dothraki. They disliked ships, hated the salt water, believed demons inhabited the open waters. But now, a vast portion of Drogo's khalasar, and others, had glimpsed a future in the shape of 3 hatchlings. They would set aside superstitions if it meant unimaginable loot and glory. Viserys listened, weaving in and out of lucidity as he fought back the throb in his wounds. He heard Drogo's men talk of summoning ship captains from Pentos, Volantis, and Qohor, men who would do business for a high price. In time, they would gather enough vessels to ferry tens of thousands of Dothraki and their horses across the narrow sea. The timeline was vague, perhaps months of preparation. Viserys fretted at the delay, but recognized it couldn't be helped. The dragons needed time to grow, and the khalasar needed time to accept the crossing. That meant patience, a virtue he did not possess in abundance. Still, the promise of a real invasion brightened his mood. He pictured landing on the coast of Westeros, the black dragon now large enough to scorch entire companies of knights. The small folk would flee, or else fall to their knees in worship. He pictured the Red Keep, the hated Lannisters scattered, the Starks kneeling, the Baratheon bastard who now wore the crown cowering in fear. Those thoughts stoked the fire in his belly, enough to keep him upright despite the agony. Soon after, the old gray-braided Khal rose and departed, speaking with some of his riders. Several other warlords followed, drifting away into the night, presumably to brood on how best to handle this new dynamic. Khal Drogo remained along with a handful of his blood riders, exchanging toasts with Viserys. The hours wore on, and the crowd thinned as some collapsed in drunken stupors, while others went off to find their beds, or each other. Viserys finally let a servant guide him back to his tent, weaving around smoldering fires and half-conscious revelers. The black dragon clung to him, tail wrapped protectively around his arm. He found the other 2 hatchlings asleep, curled together in the basket, a scene that stirred a rare softness in his heart. They were his offspring in a sense, his legacy. He dismissed the servant and sank onto a thin mattress, head spinning. The black dragon hopped off to join its siblings, nestling with them in a tangle of scales and wings. In the candle's wavering glow, Viserys studied his bandaged arm. The cloth was stained a dull red, and pain radiated under it like a smoldering coal. He swallowed a groan. Tomorrow, it would likely be worse, but tonight, he still felt that exhilarating thrum of victory. He drifted into a fitful sleep, dream fragments swirling. In one vision, he walked through the throne room in King's Landing. the floor littered with bones. The Iron Throne loomed, twisted steel reflecting a blood-red sunset. He climbed its steps, each footfall echoing like thunder. At the top, he found a single dragon egg, larger than the hatchling's shells, pulsing with a crimson glow. He reached out, only to see Daenerys behind him, sorrow in her eyes. He tried to snatch the egg away, but it dissolved into ash. With a cry, he woke to the darkness of his tent. The candle had burned low, casting trembling shadows across the walls. The 3 dragons were still curled in their basket, breathing softly. Outside, the faint clamor of the city had quieted to occasional shouts or laughter. He rubbed his face, trying to banish the lingering dread. Though the dream unsettled him, he told himself it was nothing more than residual fear. He would not let Daenerys overshadow him again. He was the father of dragons, the slayer of Akal, the future king of Westeros. No dream, no prophecy would stand in his way. When morning arrived, his entire body felt leaden, and his arm burned with fever. The wound was inflamed, but the Dothraki healers applied more of their pungent concoctions. He forced himself to eat a meager breakfast, determined not to appear weak. The black dragon perched on the edge of his bed, cocking its head curiously whenever he winced. By midday, word came that the lesser Khals were gathering for a council of sorts, discussing the logistics of uniting under Drogo's banner to plan the crossing. Viserys forced himself upright, arms trembling. If he wanted these men to follow him as the father of dragons, he needed to be present. Every moment counted in forging the alliances that would tear down the usurper. The black hatchling followed at his heels as he left the tent, while the other 2 remained dozing in the basket. He emerged into the bright sunlight, squinting against the glare. The city, still alive with a hum of activity, seemed caught between awe and uncertainty. He passed clusters of warriors practicing with arcs, a group of crones chanting over a fire, and endless lines of horses tethered near makeshift stables. Everywhere, he caught furtive glances, hushed whispers. He no longer needed to bark orders for the thralls. They scurried to provide him with water or food, or whatever else he might need. A measure of fear of the unknown, had settled around him, and he relished it. He spotted Daenerys near a shaded pavilion, speaking softly to a stooped old woman wearing the distinctive robes of the Dosh Khaleen. Daenerys' posture looked tense, her arms folded protectively over her midsection. Viserys pretended not to notice and strode past, heading for the large tent where the Khals were said to gather. Inside, the air was thick with incense and sweat. Khal Drogo and the gray-braided Khal lounged on cushions, discussing in rapid Dothraki. Another Khal, the one who had spat in the dirt the day before, stood by a post, arms crossed, expression grim. Bloodriders and other warriors filled the space, their eyes flicking warily between each other. As Viserys entered, a hush fell. The men parted to let him approach. He inclined his head in greeting, ignoring the pain that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. "You speak of crossing," he said in broken Dothraki, halting but firm. "I am here." Drogo nodded, then rattled off several sentences. The translator rushed in to fill the gap. "He says they have never united so many Khalasars for one purpose. They debate how many ships are needed, how much gold must be spent. The costs will be vast." Viserys pulled in a breath. "I can secure gold in Pentos," he lied smoothly. Illyrio Mopatis had coins, certainly, and Illyrio would be eager to see the Targaryen restoration if it meant more profit. "If gold is what we need, I can promise it." The gray-braided Khal narrowed his eyes. He spoke a question to the translator, who frowned. "He asks, if you are this king, why do you not have an army of your own to pay for these things?" Viserys set his jaw, reminding himself that these men understood only direct might. "My throne was stolen when I was a child. I have been in exile, gathering strength. Now I have dragons. That is worth more than any army of Sellswords." And then, a murmur rippled through the tent. One bloodrider snorted, unconvinced. Khal Drogo lifted a hand to silence them. More harsh words were exchanged in Dothraki that Viserys struggled to follow. He caught references to Qarth, to Slaver's Bay, to the voyages that might yield enough ships to carry thousands of horses. If a single vessel could carry only a fraction of their forces, they would need dozens, perhaps hundreds, of ships. The scale of it was staggering. Drogo turned to Viserys at last. The translator's voice faltered for a moment, as if uncertain how to phrase the warlord's words. "The Khal says your dragons give hope. But the crossing will be dangerous. Many men may die. He wants to know how you will reward those who follow." Viserys' lips twisted into a fierce grin. "With the spoils of Westeros," he promised. "Lands of green fields, as far as the eye can see, filled with riches and cities. Castles that can be sacked, their larders overflowing. The best women, the finest horses, gold beyond measure. I will reward loyalty with wealth beyond imagining." The translator repeated his words. Gradually, an eager murmur spread. The mention of Greenland resonated with men who had spent their lives riding parched plains or scorching deserts. Viserys caught the spark of desire in their eyes. He pressed on, summoning what remained of his strength. "We will need to gather supplies, secure ships, plan the crossing carefully. But once we have landed, the 7 kingdoms will fall like wheat before the scythe." One of the blood riders, his face etched with suspicion, asked a curt question. The translator pursed her lips. "Hay says, what if the men of Westeros are strong? They have knights in steel armor." Viserys let out a brittle laugh. "Do you think steel can stop dragon fire?" He gestured to the black hatchling, perched on his shoulder, eyes glinting like embers. "This is only the beginning. When they grow, my dragons will make all armor worthless. The Dothraki are fearsome. Add a dragon's flame, and entire armies will crumble." A hush, then a ripple of agreement from many. The men nodded, exchanging excited glances. Khal Drogo rose, looming tall. He clasped Viserys' uninjured arm, bellowing a phrase that set the gathered warriors pounding their chests in unison. The translator's eyes shone as she interpreted. "The Khal says it is decided. We prepare for war. We gather ships. We ride to the shores of the Jade Sea if we must. All will unite behind the dragon." The chant spread, pounding like a drumbeat against the tent walls. Viserys let out a trembling exhale, relief and triumph swirling in his veins. The first major step had been taken. The Dothraki were ready, at least in principle, to cross the sea under his banner. Once those ships were secured, the invasion would be inevitable. He glanced at the black dragon, which hissed softly, as if sensing the rising energy in the room. "Yes," he thought, "fire and blood. We will take what is ours." In that moment, his fever and his pain receded into the background, overshadowed by the blaze of ambition. The father of dragons had begun his conquest in earnest. All that remained was to see it through, one step at a time, until the 7 kingdoms lay at his feet. Nothing would halt the return of House Targaryen. He would see to that personally, no matter the cost, even if it meant burning every corner of Westeros until the Iron Throne was rightfully his. "Gang? How?" Viserys Targaryen stirred from fitful sleep to find the black hatchling peering at him, its amber eyes reflecting the torchlight like 2 glowing embers. He lay on a narrow pallet within the large communal tent, where Khal Drogo and his closest blood riders gathered each night. Outside, the night air hummed with muffled celebrations. The Dothraki had resolved to unite behind the father of dragons, yet Viserys felt restless. His body ached with the sting of half-healed burns and fresh sword wounds, each reminding him that glory never came without pain. He pulled himself upright, ignoring the lancing hurt across his bandaged left arm. A Dothraki servant girl, Hay still hadn't bothered to learn her name, hurried over to offer him a bowl of spiced wine. He accepted, lifting it to his lips. The brew burned hot, tasting of pepper and fermented mare's milk beneath the tang of cheap Essosi spices. It was far from the fine arbor reds he vaguely remembered from his childhood in King's Landing, but it dulled the throb in his wounds, and that was all he required. The black dragon perched upon the edge of the pallet, stretching its wings with a quiet hiss. Viserys watched the creature in the wavering torchlight. Each passing day, it seemed to grow bolder, its scales darkening from charcoal to pure obsidian, sharpened ridges forming along its spine. Sometimes at night, it coughed up tiny gusts of smoke, spitting sparks that made the Dothraki chatter in alarmed excitement. The green and cream hatchlings were quieter, less inclined toward fiery outbursts, but they, too, would expand their wings soon enough. Viserys understood he had only begun to glimpse the power that would one day make him invincible. He rose unsteadily, the bowl of wine sloshing, and limped to the tent's entrance. The black dragon hopped along after him, half gliding, half stumbling. Outside, a vast moon hung low over V's Dothrak.d. Flickering bonfires lent the city a dreamlike haze, illuminating the hulking silhouettes of ancient idols and columns. Drums throbbed somewhere in the distance. He heard the neigh of horses, the braying of a donkey, the occasional raucous shout. He moved past dozing guards and stepped into the open. The night air kissed his skin, carrying a faint chill that soothed his feverish flesh. He found himself longing for the salt breeze of the narrow sea, for the day he would stand on a ship's deck, bound for Westeros with a legion of riders behind him. Such a crossing might be months away, but the mere notion sparked a tremor of anticipation. He could almost smell the lavender fields near Highgarden, and picture the tall towers of Casterly Rock that he would soon tear down. Ahead of him stretched a broad clearing where Dothraki caravans had formed a half-circle, their wagons piled high with goods and stolen treasures. Viserys saw ragged slaves huddled together for warmth, wearing expressions of hopelessness as they tried to sleep on packed earth. He passed them by without a flicker of sympathy. The Targaryens had once taken the entire continent of Westeros by fire. A few thralls to carry baggage or row ships in Essos meant nothing to him. He stumbled upon a quiet corner near a cluster of tall spear-like stones. The black dragon sniffed at the air, tail lashing. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, suggesting a storm might be coming. Viserys settled on a flat rock, ignoring the dull pain as he eased himself down. He reached out, and the little black beast hopped into his lap, wings half furled. He stroked its smooth scales, feeling warmth radiate from beneath. The bond between them was tangible in moments like this. He sensed faint stirrings, as if glimpsing the creature's raw emotions. A swirl of primal hunger, a flicker of recognition. He felt his own heartbeat steady in response. "There will be storms ahead, Naharza," he whispered in a language only half his own, a mixture of common tongue and Old Valyrian. "But we are storm and fire alike. We bend or break for none." Lightning flickered across the sky, revealing a silhouette on a nearby rise. Someone watched him. For an instant he tensed, prepared to snap at whomever dared disturb his solitude. But as the lightning traced the outline of silver hair, he knew it was Daenerys. She stood barefoot, cloaked in a light wrap that fluttered in the breeze. She made no move to come closer. Instead, she gazed at the moonlit city as if lost in thought. Viserys felt a spike of anger, hot and irrational. Even now, with the dragons at his side, he couldn't banish the memory of all those whispers that had once cast her as the rightful Targaryen to reclaim the throne. He had proven them wrong, hatched the eggs himself in fire, and yet he still sensed a question in every corner. How did Daenerys truly fit into this prophecy of dragons? He let the black hatchling slip from his lap and rumbled low in his throat, compelling it to remain by his side. Then he rose and made his way toward Daenerys. She turned at his approach, her eyes reflecting the faint starlight. For a moment, neither spoke. The distant glow of a bonfire caught in her hair, lending her an ethereal quality that reminded him uncomfortably of their mother, a woman he barely remembered. Daenerys spoke first, her voice carrying over the hush. "You should be resting. The wound on your arm hasn't healed." He set his jaw. "I don't need you fussing over my injuries. Not anymore." Her gaze dropped to the black dragon padding across the grass behind him. It made a soft chirp, uncertain if it should greet her or keep distance. Her face flickered with longing. "They are growing," she noted. "You can see it in their eyes." Viserys nodded curtly, refusing to let warmth infiltrate his tone. "Yes, one day Westeros will see as well." She drew her wrap tighter around her shoulders. "These storms," she murmured, looking at the thickening clouds above. "They roll in quickly here. I've noticed." He wondered if she was speaking literally or about a greater shift in fortune. "If we are wise, they'll serve us," he said. "If not, they'll wash us away." A tense silence lingered. The faint roll of thunder carried across the plains. At last, Daenerys spoke in a gentler voice. "I heard the Khalasars have decided to move east, to Slaver's Bay first, in search of ships and alliances." He exhaled, a small measure of relief seeping into him that she wasn't spouting some challenge. "Yes," he confirmed. "From Slaver's Bay to Volantis, and from Volantis to Pentos if needed. Illyrio Mopatis may help us with gold. The Dothraki will gather vessels, or buy them, or take them by force. Eventually we'll cross the sea." She nodded. "How long until we depart Vase Dothrak?" "Soon," he said, though the details were murkier than he liked to admit. "Within a fortnight, I expect. Khal Drogo is eager to keep momentum. He knows the other Khals won't remain here once the excitement wanes." She glanced at the black dragon. "And the hatchlings?" His eyes narrowed. "They will come with me. All three." She paused as though weighing her next words carefully. Rain began to patter around them, gentle at first. "Let me help," she said. "I could care for them when you are wounded, or—" "No." He snapped the word before she could finish. The black dragon hissed in unison, as if echoing its master. He felt a pang of satisfaction that it remained loyal to him alone. "I don't need you to tend them. I have the thralls. I have my own 2 hands. They chose me, Daenerys. Don't forget that." Lightning revealed the flash of hurt in her expression, but she lifted her chin. "You are my brother," she said at last. "And they are the last of our house's legacy. I only thought—" "I told you what I think," he interrupted, voice tight. "Do not presume to handle them behind my back. You saw how they shied from you after hatching." She closed her eyes briefly, blinking away that shard of pain. "I only want them to survive, Viserys. I want House Targaryen to survive." He clenched his fists, ignoring the droplets that began to streak his hair. "And it will. I will see to that. The dragons and I. Not you." "Be." Without another word, he turned, calling the black dragon to his side. It obeyed, claws clicking on stone. Daenerys remained on the ridge, watching him walk away in the thickening rain. Part of him wanted to whirl back, to fling insults until she left him alone, but something in her quiet, wounded gaze gave him pause. He hated how she still had a claim on certain memories of their childhood, how she made him think of gentler times he wanted to bury. So he pressed forward, determined to fix his attention solely on the future. As he neared his tent, the drumming rain intensified, creating puddles on the trampled earth. A swirl of half-sleeping warriors roused themselves, cursing the downpour. Viserys slipped inside where the green and cream dragons were dozing on a makeshift perch fashioned from a wooden stand and a layer of furs. They blinked at him, blinking again when lightning lit the canvas walls. He beckoned, letting them hop onto his arms. He felt the strain on his bandaged flesh, but gritted his teeth. Their presence made him feel whole, somehow, as if the raw wound in his pride had a means to mend. Sinking onto his cot, he laid the dragons in a circle around him. The black one nestled closest, warm as a coal, exhaling tiny clouds of smoke. Outside, thunder rumbled. Viserys closed his eyes, letting exhaustion claim him in increments. Before he fully drifted off, a final thought crossed his mind. Soon they would depart Vase Dothrak. Soon he would begin the march across Essos in earnest, forging a path of fire and blood. He dreamed of a great winged shadow crossing the sea. In the dream, he soared behind the black dragon's powerful shoulders, the wind roaring in his ears. Sunlight reflected off endless water, and in the distance, he glimpsed the coast of Westeros. Bells tolled. Once more, those cursed bells that had heralded his father's end. And then abruptly, he saw kings landing in flames, the Red Keep collapsing under the wrath of living dragons. People fled in terror. He exulted in the sight, the heartbreak of the past, devoured by righteous vengeance. But just as he circled the tallest tower, something pulled him downward. The black dragon turned its head, revealing not the beast's face, but Daenerys' features, silver hair swirling in the wind. Then the dream dissolved, leaving him in darkness. He awoke drenched in sweat despite the chill. The storm still raged outside. He realized dawn was breaking, though the skies remained gray and violent. Muffled curses and neighing horses drifted in, telling him the Dothraki were already stirring. He forced himself upright, peeled away blood-crusted bandages to check his wound. The cut from his duel had scabbed over, though the flesh around it looked inflamed. Another scar to join the burns. They no longer mattered as they once did. Any physical sacrifice felt trivial if it brought him closer to the Iron Throne. The black dragon lifted its head, blinking groggily. He remembered the dream then, the strange fusion of Daenerys' face with the beast's. Irritation prickled him. He would not let his sister intrude upon the union he forged. He muttered a curse and set about calling for fresh bandages, determined to push away the unease that lingered from his sleep. By midday the storm ebbed, leaving the ground a mess of mud. The Khals convened beneath an open-sided pavilion near the center of Vaes Dothrak. They sat on hide-bound cushions, their horses tethered close. Viserys arrived with the black dragon perched on his shoulder, a visual reminder of his status. The stares that followed him only confirmed how the tales of his miracle had spread. As he settled among them, the green and cream hatchlings remained back at the tent, watched by a handful of Drogo's most trusted men. Khal Drogo greeted him with a nod. "We ride soon," he declared in Dothraki, his voice a low thunder. The translator, a middle-aged woman with cords in her hair, stepped forward to interpret. "The Khal says the time in Vaes Dothrak is ending. He will not linger here. The riders grow restless and the other Khals demand motion." Viserys cast a quick glance around. He recognized the older Khal with gray braids, the one who had begun to warm to the idea of dragon-led conquest. A younger Khal glowered from beneath thick brows, still resentful of Viserys' sudden rise in influence. The father of dragons perched in a precarious alliance, knowing any sign of weakness could invite another challenge. He raised his voice. "I agree. We cannot conquer a kingdom from here. We must move east, gather ships, then cross to Westeros. Nendebdiano." The translator echoed his words, and a rumble of assent passed through the group. The older Khal asked something in rapid Dothraki. Once more, the translator turned to Viserys. "He wants to know how soon the dragons can fly. He says it's pointless to cross the sea if they're too small to bring fire upon the enemy." Viserys suppressed a flicker of uncertainty. "Dragons grow quickly, fed on blood and fire," he said, choosing his words carefully. "By the time we reach the coast, they will be far stronger than they are now. Even as hatchlings, their flame is a terror to men. The knowledge that dragons exist again will strike fear into every Westerosi heart." Khal Drogo gave a slow nod. The black dragon on Viserys' shoulder twitched, as if aware of the scrutiny. One of the blood riders extended a hesitant hand toward it, but the beast bared its minuscule fangs, snapping. Laughter rippled through the men, and the blood rider withdrew, muttering good-natured curses. They spoke for another hour about the planned route. Some proposed heading south to Meereen, others suggested the auctions of Astapor, or even the port of Yunkai. Wealth, slaves, and ships might be found in any of the three. Viserys listened, though he cared little for the details of Slaver's Bay. Let the Dothraki handle what they did best, taking what they wanted by force. All he required was a fleet, and enough gold to secure any shortfall. Illyrio Mopatis would be waiting in Pentos, no doubt eager to see if rumors of real dragons were true. That man had orchestrated Daenerys' betrothal once, but times had changed. This time Viserys would make the demands. When the meeting adjourned, a handful of the Khals rode out at once, eager to position their khalasars along the roads east. Drogo lingered, exchanging a few words with Viserys through the translator. "The Khal says that we leave in 2 days. Make your preparations." Viserys nodded curtly. "I will be ready." He turned to find Daenerys stepping into the pavilion. Her expression was composed, though a faint tremor of tension threaded her posture. She cast a brief glance at him, then approached Khal Drogo with measured steps. Drogo's face softened when he saw her, and he reached out, pulling her into a quick, possessive embrace. Their exchange was in low murmurs, the translator unneeded for such intimacies. Viserys watched, a cold ache stirring in his gut. Drogo's acceptance of him hinged partly on Daenerys' status as Khaleesi. She might claim to follow her brother's cause, but she belonged to the Khal in ways Viserys couldn't control, and that in turn bound Drogo's power to the Targaryen cause. With a forced calm, he left them, exiting into the muddy streets. Stalls selling skewered meats, exotic spices, and bits of stolen finery bustled with activity. He strode through them, ignoring the hawkers and beggars who cried out for coin. A pair of blood riders shadowed him at a distance, uncertain if their job was to protect or surveil. Viserys didn't care. He had the only true protection he needed perched on his shoulder, flicking its tail. In a quiet alley beyond the market, he found a stack of crates. He set the black dragon down, letting it sniff around. Grime stained the crate's surface, but Viserys didn't care. He tore off a piece of dried meat from his pouch, offering it to the creature. It gobbled the morsel hungrily, squeaking for more. He fed it patiently, each sliver of flesh reminding him how the beast grew with every meal. A small voice broke the hush. "She's beautiful." He turned sharply, seeing a wide-eyed Dothraki child peering around the corner, perhaps 9 or 10 years old. The child's hair was cropped short, an odd style among the riders. Viserys realized it might be some servant or orphan. The child looked enthralled by the sight of the black dragon, half hiding behind a wooden post. "You shouldn't be here," Viserys snapped, suddenly conscious that any threat to the dragon could not be tolerated. The child hesitated, eyes fixed on the hatchling's shining scales. "Did you make her come out of a stone?" the child asked in halting common tongue. Viserys frowned, but a part of him felt a flicker of pride. Even a child recognized the wonder of what he had done. "Yes," he said simply. "I hatched her from a dragon's egg." The child's mouth hung open. "Will she be big as a mountain?" Viserys let out a quiet laugh. "Perhaps. Now go on. You've seen enough." "Namasawaru." The child took a step closer, small hands trembling in excitement. The black dragon hissed softly, uncertain if this newcomer posed danger. Before Viserys could bark another warning, the child retreated, startled by the hiss, then darted away into the shadows. He exhaled, picking the hatchling up, feeling its heartbeat fluttering against his palm. "You frighten children now," he said wryly, though with a hint of satisfaction. "Someday you'll frighten kings." The next 2 days in V's Dothrak were a blur of frenetic preparation. Countless tents came down, wagons loaded with provisions rumbled across muddy paths, and riders tended to the hooves of thousands of horses. Viserys spent hours ensuring a secure means to transport his 3 dragons. He arranged for a covered wagon lined with straw and cloth to keep them sheltered from sun or storms, though he intended to carry the black one himself, as often as possible. He had no illusions about the danger. In the chaos of a moving khalasar, a single misstep or unlucky jolt could injure a hatchling. But he refused to leave them behind or entrust them to anyone else's care for too long. He glimpsed Daenerys only in passing. She seemed equally preoccupied, conversing with members of the Dash Khaleen and her own retinue of handmaids who had grown fond of her. Khal Drogo watched everything with an ever-present confidence, issuing commands for how the different khalasars would ride together without clashing. The older Khal with gray braids showed reluctant cooperation, clearly more comfortable riding independently. Yet there was an unspoken consensus. Follow the father of dragons to the Salt Sea, or lose the chance for unimaginable plunder. On the morning of departure, the sun broke through thinning clouds, casting V's Dothrak in shades of gold and copper. Thousands of warriors gathered in lines, the thunder of hooves shaking the earth. Viserys stood at the forefront with Khal Drogo, the black dragon perched on his shoulder, the other 2 in the specially prepared wagon behind him. He wore a light leather vest over his bandages, his arms stiff but functional. The fresh scabs itched terribly, but he refused to show discomfort. Drogo signaled with a curt wave, and the procession began. The Dothraki cheered, brandishing aurics and spears, eager to depart. Viserys mounted a lean, dappled horse that had been gifted to him by one of the lesser Khals. He wasn't an accomplished rider by Dothraki standards, but he could manage well enough. The black hatchling clung to his shoulder, adjusting its wings for balance. He held the reins gingerly, scanning the sea of riders stretching behind him. They were his, or at least they believed so. They followed the promise of dragons and the conquest of distant lands. Daenerys rode near Khal Drogo, her hair braided with small silver bells. She caught Viserys' eye once, a fleeting glance, then focused on guiding her white filly. Whether that was regret or defiance in her expression, he could not tell. He forced himself to stare straight ahead, ignoring any sense of unease. He needed her loyalty only insofar as it strengthened Drogo's devotion. Past that, she was a complication he refused to indulge. The city shrank behind them, its towering statues and decaying monuments, dwarfed by the boundless grasslands. The Khalasar spread out in a formation that spanned miles, each sub-tribe trailing its own wagons and herds. Dust rose in swirling clouds under countless hooves. Viserys and Drogo rode at the head, flanked by blood riders and outriders, who fanned out to scout the roads ahead. The first few days proved exhilarating and exhausting. Viserys fought to maintain composure as his injuries flared. The black dragon fluttered restlessly. He tried to feed it scraps at intervals, discovered it disliked the constant jostle of the horse, and eventually placed it in the cushioned wagon with its siblings to let it rest. He was loath to be parted from it, but the road was long, and riding with 3 hatchlings on his person was impossible. He checked on them frequently, barking orders to the thralls who handled the wagon. They learned quickly to obey, and to keep curious hands away from the snapping jaws of the dragons. Within a week, the Dothraki reached a region of rolling hills that parted to reveal a distant horizon streaked with red. They camped near a shallow river. At twilight, fires sprang to life across the plains, creating a patchwork of flickering orange. The warbands mingled, their numbers swelled by traveling merchants who followed in the Khalasar's wake, hoping to trade cloth or food. Viserys paced around the largest fire pit, the black dragon perched on a log, warming itself. It belched a sudden spark that made a few Dothraki leap back with startled laughs. Khal Drogo reclined on furs, drinking from a horn. Viserys crouched nearby, ignoring the twinge in his wounds. "How far until we reach Meereen?" he asked. Halting Dothraki broken by occasional words in the common tongue. The translator, lingering close, provided clarity. Drogo's expression was impassive. He gestured east. 2 more moons, if the rains do not slow us." Viserys grit his teeth. 2 months was longer than had hoped. The dragons would have more time to grow, but every delay risked losing momentum. Already, he could sense the restlessness among the lesser khals. They wanted raids, violence, trophies, something to keep their thirst sated. Mere travel bored them. He resolved to find some means of fueling their enthusiasm, perhaps by encouraging small raids on any settlement or caravan unlucky enough to cross their path. That night, as the war camp settled, Viserys made his rounds, ensuring the wagon with his dragons was properly guarded. He hovered, issuing curt instructions to the men posted there, telling them to let no one near without his express permission. Then he peeked inside, seeing the green hatchling curled around the cream one, both asleep. The black dragon dozed in a corner, flicking its tail now and again. Viserys felt a swell of fierce pride. These 3 were everything. The Dothraki might be the vehicle of conquest, but the dragons were the heart of his power. Even so, images from the dream tugged at his mind. The notion of seeing Daenerys face in the dragon's form unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He assured himself it was only the fever talking, or some trivial echo of memory. He was the father of dragons. There was no place for Daenerys in their bond. He turned away from the wagon, stepping into the moonlit hush. The night sky stretched wide, pinpricked by countless stars. He thought of the painted table he had once read about in the Red Keep's library, the giant map of Westeros that Aegon the Conqueror had used to plan his invasions. Viserys imagined creating his own painted table, marking each kingdom he would subdue beneath the flight of dragons. The Stormlands, the Reach, the Vale, all would bow. King's Landing, seat of the usurper, would be the final prize. A bright hunger ignited in him, overshadowing the dull ache of his injuries. Dawn came and went. The Khalasar pressed on. The hills sloped into flatter grasslands again. Over time, the monotony of the road threatened to dull even Viserys' sense of purpose. But the presence of the dragons never failed to revive it. Every day he saw changes. The black dragon's wings grew more defined. The green one's spine developed small, pale ridges, and the cream one's eyes took on a deeper hue of molten gold. Sometimes he tested them by lighting small fires in a sheltered spot at camp, coaxing the black dragon to belch flame. It often sputtered, but each time a spurt of fire emerged, he felt his heart surge. At the same time, he found himself increasingly impatient. His feverish dreams came and went, often merging memories of King's Landing in flames with fleeting glimpses of Daenerys wreathed in some strange light. He began snapping at the Dothraki, complaining about the slow pace, the endless grass. On one occasion, he saw a small village on the horizon, a scattering of mud huts and palisades. The people had deserted it, likely upon hearing the thunder of thousands of horses. Viserys suggested they raise it anyway, a demonstration of power. Khal Drogo only shrugged. There was nothing left to loot. Viserys scowled, fuming at the missed opportunity to inspire fear. Weeks blurred. The harsh sun and occasional downpours left the roads slick. Several wagon wheels broke in the mud, delaying them further. Viserys all but raged when one of these breakdowns risked jostling the dragon's wagon, but the Dothraki saw to repairs in a matter of hours. Each small annoyance fueled the tension in his chest. He dreamed nightly of Westeros, of a triumphant arrival that felt agonizingly distant. Amid this march, Daenerys made a quiet effort to speak with him. Sometimes she found him at dusk, sitting outside his tent, the black dragon sprawled across his lap. Her handmaids kept a respectful distance, and she approached with an almost timid caution. Viserys would glare, daring her to speak. She often asked how his wounds fared, or expressed curiosity about the dragon's feeding, as though seeking some new way to connect. He remained guarded, suspicious of her motives. One evening, however, when she asked softly about the best method of delivering raw meat to the black dragon, he felt his anger waver. "It likes the meat warmed by a small flame," he admitted, hating the trace of vulnerability in his voice. "It seems to prefer goat or lamb. Horse is a last resort, but the Dothraki have it in abundance." She nodded, hands clasped before her. "I could help heat it, if you wish," she offered. "I have some skill in cooking. I'm sure your thralls are capable, but—" He cut her off with a dismissive wave. "They can manage. I won't risk confusing the dragon by having too many handlers." He saw the disappointment in her eyes, but forced himself to remain unmoved. That night, he lay awake, occasionally glancing at the black hatchling's tiny chest, rising and falling as it slept. Something in him whispered that Daenerys might not be an enemy. She might in her own way be an asset. But pride and old resentments clamped down on that thought before it could bloom. The Khalasar pressed on. Days turned to weeks, the grass giving way to more arid terrain, patches of stony ground, and twisted shrubs. On the horizon, the shapes of distant settlements rose and fell like mirages. Sometimes they circled wide around them, having no reason to venture closer. At other times, a few outriders swung by to extort tribute from local inhabitants, or to test the steel of any defenders they encountered. Viserys found such trifling skirmishes beneath him. Only a real conquest would satisfy his thirst. Then came a day when scouts galloped into camp bearing news. They had spotted a large caravan traveling from Korth to Meereen, laden with silks, gems, and rumored gold. The lesser Khals wanted to raid. They saw it as a chance to stave off boredom, gather wealth, and test their might. Viserys seized the opportunity. If the Dothraki captured that caravan, it might speed their cause. Purchasing ships became easier when one had chests of gold. He met with Khal Drogo in the latter's tent, the black dragon coiled on his forearm. Drogo and his blood riders listened intently as the translator relayed Viserys' plan to intercept the caravan at a strategic point where the road curved around a rocky escarpment. If the Dothraki attacked at dusk, they'd have the advantage of speed and surprise. Drogo grinned, baring strong white teeth. Fighting appealed to him far more than dull marches. The other Khals quickly concurred. The next afternoon they advanced with stealth, dividing the riders into two flanks that would encircle the caravan. Viserys didn't plan to engage in direct combat. He was no fool. He was still recovering, and the risk of losing his life was too great to chance. So he positioned himself on a slight rise overlooking the road, flanked by a handful of loyal men and with the black dragon perched in a specially prepared harness on his chest. It squawked in annoyance at being restrained, but he didn't dare let it flutter off in the midst of battle. The green and cream hatchlings remained back in the wagon, guarded by half a dozen hand-picked warriors. From his vantage point, Viserys watched the swirl of dust on the horizon. The caravan emerged, a long line of wagons and beasts of burden, flanked by hired guards in mismatched armor. At a signal from Drogo, a single piercing cry, the Dothraki thundered forth from both sides. The caravan guards scrambled, brandishing spears, but they were hopelessly outmatched by the speed and ferocity of the riders. Hoofbeats thundered across the hard-packed road. Dust rose in chaotic swirls, and the shouts and clang of steel filled the air. Viserys caught glimpses of men falling, screams of panic. He felt a hot rush in his veins, a savage thrill as he imagined the spoils soon to be his. The black hatchling hissed, sensing his excitement. Within minutes, the fight was all but decided. The Dothraki cut down most of the guards, or drove them fleeing into the wilderness. A few wagons caught fire, adding acrid smoke to the scene. Camels and mules brayed in terror. Drogo's men forced the caravan drivers to the ground, disarming them. Two lesser khals brandished bloodied arcs, howling their victory to the sky. Viserys urged his horse forward, descending the rise at a canter. The black dragon tightened its claws, digging uncomfortably into the leather harness. As he reached the line of seized wagons, he dismounted. The Dothraki parted to let him through, many bowing their heads in respect. Khal Drogo stood in the midst of the spoils, surveying the carnage. His braids swayed, bells jingling faintly in the dusty wind. Viserys spotted battered chests among the wreckage, likely containing valuables. Silk and spices spilled onto the ground, and the reek of spilled oil filled his nostrils. Drogo beckoned him closer. Through the translator, the Khal said, "All this is ours. Choose what you need for the crossing." Viserys dismounted, letting one of the blood riders hold his reins. He strode among the wrecked wagons, ignoring the moans of wounded men. Another blood rider pried open a large wooden crate, revealing rows of golden figurines, perhaps temple idols from the Shadowlands. Viserys seized one, weighing it in his hand. Gold was gold, regardless of the shape. It gleamed in the sun, promising coin enough to buy more wagons, more supplies, or bribe unscrupulous merchants in Meereen or Pentos. He tossed the idol aside to a thrall and ordered them to collect the entire chest. A ragged figure crawled near his boots, a caravan guard who'd lost his helmet. He raised trembling hands in supplication, eyes wide with fear at the sight of the black dragon. In broken Valyrian, he pleaded for mercy, claiming he was but a hired sword with no real loyalty. Viserys regarded him coolly. He felt no pity, but the man might have information on the markets of Meereen. "We'll spare you if you can lead us to the right brokers," he said, "where the best ships and captains can be bought. Do that, and your life may continue." The guard nodded frantically, tears carving streaks in the dust on his face. Viserys nodded to a pair of Dothraki, who hauled the man to his feet. If he proved useless, there'd be no shortage of ways to dispose of him. He gazed upon the spoils, barrels of exotic perfume, sacks of saffron, crates of fine cloth, all worthless to him personally, but immensely valuable in trade. The black dragon let out a hungry whine. His adrenaline surged, and he tore a chunk of raw meat from a fallen pack animal. Offering it to the beast, it devoured the morsel, ignoring the stench of blood. Around them, Drogo's warriors whooped and started dividing the lesser treasures. Fine blankets, strange trinkets, small casks of sweet wine. Viserys took a moment to savor the triumph. This was only a taste of what awaited in Westeros, where entire castles brimmed with tapestries, coin, and relics of old. He pictured the Red Keep's vaults, rumored to be stuffed with gold dragons minted under King Aerys. He imagined taking the Iron Throne as a conqueror, hearing that clang of metal as he settled on its spiked seat. and feeling the hush that would descend as all knelt before him. A commotion near one of the wagons drew his attention. Dothraki voices raised, laughter peppered with lewd remarks. Viserys walked over and saw a group of warriors dragging a handful of caravan survivors. Women, it seemed, out from beneath the torn canopy of a wagon. The women clutched each other, terror etched on their faces. One was older, with lined cheeks. Another was a girl barely in her teens. The Dothraki circled them like circling wolves, eager to claim prizes. Viserys set his jaw. This was normal for the Dothraki, he knew, but the sight reminded him, uncomfortably, of how the world had treated him and Daenerys. He forced the memory aside. He had no illusions that war spared the weak. Still, a flicker of distaste lingered in him. He turned away, feeling the black dragon shift. Perhaps sensing his agitation, Khal Drogo caught his eye, raising a brow. The translator approached, quietly saying, "The Khal wonders if you want one of the captives. A gift for your victory." Viserys swallowed a surge of nausea. He shook his head curtly. "No, you? That doesn't interest me. I need gold, not that." "Then it shafts." Drogo shrugged, unperturbed, and the men continued their sport. Viserys left them to it, reminding himself that forging an empire meant accepting the savage nature of the Dothraki. He could not let squeamishness derail his conquest. Nonetheless, the image of the terrified captives clung to him longer than he wished. Stirring an unease he tried to bury beneath calculations of how many chests of gold they'd acquired. As the dust settled and the prisoners were herded off, Viserys found himself near Daenerys, who had ridden up on her white filly to watch from a safe distance. Her handmaids hovered protectively. When she saw him, her eyes flicked to the harness containing the black dragon. "You were not wounded this time." He managed a tight smirk. "I stayed clear of the fight. Others did the bleeding for me." She nodded, her expression somber as she regarded the carnage. He noticed her lips parted, as if she wished to speak. But she said nothing. Instead, she touched the flank of her horse and wheeled away, returning to Khal Drogo's side. The exchange left Viserys with a hollow feeling. Though he told himself it was only the stress of the raid, they pressed on at dawn with new wagons, crates, and terrified prisoners. Viserys ensured that the largest chest of gold trinkets was locked under guard. He needed to show potential ship captains and Myronese merchants that he had the wealth to pay for their vessels. Once he had a fleet, the gates to Westeros would crack open. At night, when the fires burned low and the Dothraki celebrated their spoils, Viserys sat alone with the dragons. The black one hunched on his knees, the green and cream perched on a broad rock to either side. He watched them devour slivers of fresh goat, their needle-like teeth tearing through sinew. He whispered Valyrian phrases he had half remembered from old scrolls, words about forging a bond of flame and blood. The hatchlings responded with soft trills, half squawks, occasionally belching small puffs of smoke. In those moments, he felt a sense of destiny so strong it almost overwhelmed him. The months of hardship, the scorn he'd endured, the legacy of exile, they meant nothing. All that mattered was the truth embodied by these creatures. The Targaryen's hour of glory was returning. He recalled the dream where he soared on dragon wings, burning away the last vestiges of the usurper's rule. Even if the path to that dream bristled with danger, he would stride forward without wavering. He had to. Their journey continued, day after punishing day. The Dothraki soared across open plains, forded rivers, skirted around desert expanses. They seized smaller caravans with minimal resistance. They devoured what they could, feeding their horses and capturing occasional slaves. Bit by bit, they crept closer to Meereen, or so the scouts claimed. Viserys' sense of time became fluid, measured only by the dragon's growth and the collection of gold. He ached in every limb but refused to show it, especially when Khal Drogo or any other Khals were near. He was the father of dragons. He could not appear weak. Every so often, he glimpsed Daenerys out of the corner of his eye. She rode confidently now, no longer the frightened girl he once knew. Sometimes the Dothraki around her laughed and called her Khaleesi, speaking of her in fond, respectful tones. It occurred to Viserys that she had carved a place for herself here, independent of him. He disliked the thought. He reminded himself that, in the end, she was only important insofar as she secured Drogo's loyalty. But late at night, in half-forgotten corners of his dreams, her face haunted him. After another fortnight, the land began to change. Greener, more cultivated, with scattered villages and farmland protected by low walls. The outriders reported signs of Meereen's outlying territories, not far away. Viserys felt a surge of anticipation. If all went well, they would secure ships here. And if the Meereenese refused, the Dothraki would know how to handle that. On the eve of their arrival, the Khalasar made a massive encampment, with thousands of tents and wagons spread across a gently rolling plain. Fires dotted the twilight, a sight so large and sprawling it resembled a city of moving flames. Viserys paced near his wagon, arms folded, the black dragon coiled on a thick branch he'd set upright as a perch. He could sense that every step brought him closer to the fateful crossing. Soon, the entire shape of the world would shift. He expected Daenerys to remain with Khal Drogo, but she appeared at the periphery of the wagon, her expression guarded. A swirl of tension coiled in him. She took a tentative step forward, gazing at the black dragon. "They grow stronger every day," she said softly. Viserys felt a surge of pride. "They do," he allowed. "Soon, everyone will know the truth of our house." She didn't try to touch the dragon this time, merely observed it from a respectful distance. Its eyes flicked to her, but showed no hostility, only watchful curiosity. The flames from a nearby torch danced on its obsidian scales. Daenerys broke the silence, her voice low. "Meereen is a slave city. The men there are cruel, but they also have gold. I've heard they love spectacle, especially in their fighting pits. If you offer them something as grand as a dragon, they'll swarm to your side, or fear you." "Memams," Viserys snorted. "Let them fear me. Let them pay dearly for the privilege. I will not parade my dragons for their amusement, like beasts in a menagerie." She nodded. "Of course not. But be mindful, they have their own cunning. If you want their ships, you must speak a language they understand." He narrowed his eyes. "I know what I'm doing," he snapped, though a part of him acknowledged her words. "Don't think you can advise me, sister. I've come this far without your counsel." She inclined her head. "I'm not trying to offend you. I simply want us to succeed." Her tone was genuine, but he couldn't let himself trust it. Instead, he turned to the black dragon, stroking the ridges along its neck. She stood there a moment longer, perhaps hoping for some small sign of reconciliation. When none came, she slipped away, melting back into the shadows of the Dothraki encampment. He swallowed, chest tight, refusing to dwell on the pang of guilt that teased the edges of his mind. This was no time for brotherly sentiment, not when the greatest conquest in living memory lay within reach. The next day dawned in a haze of heat and swirling dust. The walls of Meereen rose in the distance, a pale stone barrier stretching before the shimmering waters of the gulf beyond. Rows of farmland and clusters of huts lay outside the gates, and the Dothraki advanced like a thunderous wave. Word of their approach must have spread days ago, for the gates stayed closed, and spearmen stood along the battlements. Banners of house colors fluttered in the scorching wind. Viserys rode at the head with Khal Drogo. The black dragon perched on his forearm, half covered by a loose wrap to shield it from the direct sun. He felt the creature's rapid heartbeat, sensed its rising agitation at the crowd of thousands. At a safe distance from Meereen's walls, the Dothraki halted. Drogo and his riders formed a line, brandishing weapons, shouting challenges. The translator, accompanied by a herald, rode forward to parley. Viserys waited, throat constricting with impatience. He could see slender ships moored in a harbor on the far side of the city. If only they could be in his possession now. Eventually, a party of Meereenese delegates emerged through a smaller postern gate, flanked by guards in brass helms and skirts of quilted linen. They approached warily. The Dothraki parted to let them pass, hissing or spitting on the ground to show contempt. The delegates, half terrified, half curious, halted before Drogo's group, One of them was an older man clad in a fine robe embroidered with golden serpents. Another was younger, wearing a bejeweled collar that sparkled in the sun. Their eyes flicked nervously at the black dragon protruding from Viserys' wrap. Formal greetings were exchanged, the translator bridging the gap of language. The older man introduced himself as Khalzor, a member of Maraine's ruling council. He claimed the city had no wish for war with the Dothraki. Viserys forced a sneer, unimpressed by their trembling courtesy. He spoke up, letting the translator carry his words. "We haven't come to sack your city yet. We want ships. Enough ships to carry tens of thousands across the sea. Sell them to us, or help us secure them, and perhaps Meereen will remain unburned." Ian, eyes widened among the Meereenese. The younger official stammered something, glancing at the black dragon. Drogo listened impassively, arms folded across his broad chest. Viserys raised the hatchling slightly, exposing its dark scales. The delegates paled, clearly unsettled by the living embodiment of old legend. They whispered among themselves. A hush settled over the Dothraki, many of whom shot Viserys looks of eager anticipation. At last, the older official nodded reluctantly. He proposed that a small contingent enter the city to negotiate terms. Under strict truce. Viserys' heart leapt. Once inside, he could brandish not only the dragons but also the gold they'd seized. Fear and greed would do the rest. It was a start, at least. If the Meereenese tried betrayal, they would face the wrath of the Khalasar. He offered a curt nod, motioning for the black dragon to settle on his shoulder. It complied, small claws prickling through his cloak. Drogo agreed to the parley, but insisted he would not allow his bloodriders or the father of dragons to enter alone. They took time to select a retinue of Dothraki, along with a wagon bearing a taste of the spoils for display, mostly gold trinkets. By the time the midday sun was high, the party was ready. Viserys felt a swirl of excitement and caution in his gut. This was the turning point. If all went according to plan, he would leave Meereen flush with the means to cross the sea. The gates creaked open, revealing a wide avenue that led through rows of grand buildings and towering pyramids. Meereen's architecture dwarfed the camps and small villages they'd passed on the journey, though it lacked the ancient majesty of King's Landing's sprawl, at least in Viserys' eyes. Slaves in thin linen robes hurried out of the way as the Dothraki entered. Armed city guards lined the streets, their expressions wary. The father of dragons rode at the head beside Khal Drogo, the black hatchling's presence eliciting hushed gasps from spectators. A swirl of color and exotic scents enveloped them. Flowers spilled from balconies, and awnings in bright hues shaded the market stalls. Mixed in were pillars carved with scenes of past conquests, each telling a story of some long-dead ruler's triumph. Viserys eyed them with a sneer, aware that soon his own conquests would dwarf these petty claims. They arrived at a grand plaza flanked by tall statues of harpies, faces twisted in cruel smiles. There, a delegation of Meereenese nobility awaited, men and women draped in robes, wearing ornate collars of precious metals. Slaves fanned them with palm fronds, while others poured chilled wine into crystal decanters. The official called Khalzor stepped forward, beckoning Viserys, Drogo, and the translator to a large dais where cushions had been arranged. Viserys dismounted, handing his reins to a bloodrider. With every step he took, the black dragon jostled on his shoulder, letting out a thin hiss that made onlookers shudder. The dais was strewn with woven rugs, so vibrant they hurt his eyes. Khalzor gestured for them to sit, forcing a smile that barely concealed his apprehension. Drogo grunted, lowering himself onto a cushion, posture tense. A hush fell over the plaza. The younger noble stepped forward, bowing with ostentatious grace. His voice trembled as he addressed them, explaining that Meereen valued trade above conflict. If the Dothraki sought ships, perhaps an arrangement could be made. At a price, of course. Viserys listened, letting the translator keep pace, though he was already formulating a strategy. Show them the gold. Show them the dragon. Let them taste their own fear, and ensure that by the end, they were desperate to comply. He rose from his cushion, leveling the black dragon in the direction of the crowd. The creature hissed, a narrow flame bursting from its mouth. Cries echoed through the plaza, some of terror, some of astonishment. The watchers shrank back, pressing themselves against the carved pillars. Viserys spoke in a firm tone, letting each phrase drip with cold confidence. The translator's voice carried over the hush. "We have more gold than you think, and more power than you can imagine. We want ships, enough to carry the greatest Khalasar across the sea. Provide them, or lead us to those who can. In return, Meereen shall be spared our wrath. Betray us, and you will witness dragonfire tear down these walls." "Na, monsieur." Khalasar swallowed, exchanging a glance with his companions. Their fear was palpable. The father of dragons pressed on, pushing aside any flicker of compassion. This was how an empire was forged: intimidation, negotiation, conquest. He would see the next part of his dream realized here, one step closer to the Iron Throne. The hush hung, taut as a drawn bowstring, as the Meereen's lords and ladies weighed their options under the blazing sun. Viserys stood unflinching, the black dragon writhing on his shoulder, symbol of a legend renewed. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, and though sweat glistened on his brow, he felt only the fierce fire in his blood. This was the moment he had been born for. A Targaryen carving his path with living flame, no matter what or who stood in his way.